starting the second part of the day with a presentation by Justin Yu. Justin will be talking about inner source transformation, how Microsoft internally develops products and services. Enjoy the session, and Justin, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining my session. So for over next 25 minutes, I'm going to share how Microsoft, the inner source culture, and how it has changed the internal software development process. And please accept my apology in advance because I got the ankle injured, so I'd like to take a seat, okay? And if time allows, I will share my personal experience about transferring my open source project to Microsoft. So let me introduce myself. I'm Justin from Microsoft as a principal cloud advocate, and these are my social media. So if you follow me on either on LinkedIn or GitHub, then you will be getting a lot of the open source, a lot of news about the Microsoft open source, cloud native, and so on. And let's begin with this chart. So what does this chart look like? What does this chart look like? Oh, yeah. Everyone knows that. So that's right. So it's a share price history of Microsoft for over last 35 years. So as you can see, it's not been very fluctuating until 2014 or 2015, right? But from that year, from the 2015, something has happened to Microsoft. So what do you think it was? So what has made this kind of dramatic change, which is 8 times higher than 10 years ago? Because the share price doesn't lie. So we can say that there must be something has changed within Microsoft for over the last 10 years. Now, we can bring up many reasons to explain that, but I think that the changes of the software development process have fundamentally transformed the organizational culture. So throughout this session, I'd like to share how the inner source approach has transformed the internal Microsoft software development process. Then I'd like to share my personal experience as an open source project maintainer to get supported by the engineers from Microsoft. So all of us here know that how important the open source ecosystem is, right? And how open source culture is. So let's start discussion with this. So whenever you are contributing any open source project, you see these things all the time, right? So what sort of changes they have made, and what are the intentions of the change, and what kind of decision-making process they have do, and who would take care of those changes, right? We can see these things every time because it's just there, right? So what does this really mean to us? It's all about transparency, right? So we can't hide anything related to the code changes, except the recent XJet, the thing. But anyway, so it's not possible to hide those discussions at all. So if you want to, you can browse anything about the change through the code change history and code review and so on. So this is the real differentiator of an open source project, right? And this is the unique factor of the open source project. And how can we get this transparency? It's because an open source project requires the collaborations between members, right? And in other words, throughout the open source project, we work together with all members, and this working together itself is also open. Therefore, it has become a unique, the open source culture. It looks like an ideal world. So many organizations tried to integrate this open source culture with their organizational culture. But the most organizations met kind of resistance. For example, people say within the organization, they will say, why should we open our source code? Because it's our intellectual property. So why should I open that? I think that's a reasonable resistance, and that's understandable, right? And this kind of friction is expected. But it's kind of based on misunderstandings about adopting open source culture into our organization stuff, right? So have you heard of this name, Tim O'Reilly? Yeah, so that's correct. That's O'Reilly, right? So the founder of O'Reilly Media, Safari Books, and so on. So in year 2000, through his email conversation, so he introduced the concept of the inner source. He brought the open source style collaboration to the software development industry. But at that time, many companies have already adopted similar approaches to their organizations, right? So they ran their internal software development process that mimicked the open source project. In other words, they only borrowed the concept of the open source project. But that didn't work well because of that kind of resistance, right? So therefore, so companies adopting those inner source approach, they should have understood about, like, they don't have an obligation to follow the open source licensing model like GPL or MIT or whatsoever. In other words, even if their product look like an open source project, so they don't have to use the open source licensing models nor open their organization's source code because they are all the intellectual property. Instead, all they need to do is to introduce the open source culture into their companies and blend this kind of concept into their organizational culture. That's what O'Reilly suggested in his email conversation as inner source. So what are those open source culture, by the way? I mentioned these attributes earlier, right? So these are the ones belong to the open source cultures. And by achieving these factors, companies will become more transparent and accountable and collaborative. And let's take a look at this example. So you might have seen this picture, this illustration, talking about the organization culture of each big tech company, right? So it was drawn by one of Google's employees on his personal website. And there is a Microsoft. And like the Amazon, where is it? Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Oracle, and Microsoft. So I'm not going to say anything about the other companies because I have never worked that before. But it caught my attention about Microsoft, what Microsoft used to be back in the day before I joined Microsoft. So everything was top down, and from the leadership to individual engineers. And each team compete with each other. They even hurt each other. Their collaboration was kind of less than ideal, and transparency between teams was lower than expected. So of course, there must have been some level of collaborations, but that's not in ideal ways. So back in 2014, when Satya becomes the CEO of Microsoft, he told all the engineers in Microsoft like that. Let's take an open source project concept for an internal product development process. In other words, any engineer at Microsoft should be able to see the project owned by other teams and even contribute to them at any time. Therefore, all the product development process have adopted this inner source concept. So they don't have to open their code base to the public because they are all intellectual properties. But they started following the open source project cultures. And even more, nowadays, many of those products are running as open source project basis. So those projects are now have got huge the community base and grow together. And there are many organizations on GitHub. So GitHub has many of the GitHub organizations, and this is one example. So Microsoft hosts open source project. This github.com/Microsoft is one of them. So more than 6,000 projects are running as open source projects, regardless they are big or small. And more than 4,000 engineers are involved into this one GitHub organization. Another one. This is another example of GitHub organization run by Microsoft called Azure. So github.com/Azure. So it hosts more than 2,000 open source projects, and more than 2,000 engineers have contributed to those open source projects. And I'm one of them. Let's take a look at this screenshot as well. So it's about .NET Aspire, which is the container orchestration engine of building cloud-native applications. This is just an example how Microsoft open sources their product and communicate with developer communities, not just with employees. So through these issues and PRs, Microsoft shows off a certain feature as a preview or as a part of ongoing maintenance. Then try their feature and give feedback by raising issues or PRs. So from there, both Microsoft and communities start discussion for those improvements. And while .NET Aspire remains an open source project, there are other projects that use the same open source concept or approach, which we call inner source. So this documentation project isn't just an example. So mainly these documents are maintained by employees, but all the discussions and collaborations are made with this open source way, which we call inner source. So by doing so, so anyone can see the discussion, how Microsoft delivers their content on like learn.microsoft.com. And this is another example, how Microsoft actively uses the inner source approach. So instead of doing those discussions on their internal discussion tool like Microsoft Teams, they do all the code reviews and discussions directly on the GitHub repository, which makes those discussions more transparent. You know, they are not just the product or services that I got involved as an engineer. These are like I'm involved. I participated in those discussions or those projects as an end user perspective or external collaborator perspective. But the consequences are different. I got to influence them with my suggestions and ideas, and even my suggestions and ideas got accepted by the product team. And also they influenced me with the way I work in those like collaborative environment. So how was it possible? Because the product team shares their directions and shows how quickly adapt the community feedback to their product and service improvement. So it's not just about starting to use GitHub repository. The real changes I felt since I joined Microsoft in 2019 are listening to others as colleagues or companions, respecting others like companions instead of treating them as competitors. So we all realize that we grow together by helping each other. That's the most fundamental changes by adopting this open source culture as inner source culture. So for over the last 10 years, Microsoft has transformed their development culture to the inner source. Throughout this journey, Microsoft has learned many things. And one of the key learnings is sustainability. The open source ecosystem should be healthier enough. Otherwise, the entire software development ecosystem will go bad. So what was the cause that Microsoft changed their mind? Was it because of this ATIAS declaration in 2014? So let's go back to 20 years ago, which is year 2001. The former CEO, Steve Ballmer, even told that Linux is a cancer, right? But now in 2020, Microsoft has admitted they were wrong about the open source because they found that they learned a lot, and they found that how this open source culture has transformed their internal development process. Therefore, from the year 2020, Microsoft started running this website called Open at Microsoft. And in there, we declare community resources like code of conduct, license sharing policies for community contributors, and third-party license compliance policies, and open source project guidelines. So if you want to see more about the Microsoft approaches to open source, please visit this URL, aka.ms/open@Microsoft. And even more proactively to support the open source ecosystem, Microsoft has been running the FOSS Fund program since 2020. So every month, any employees who have contributed to open source projects are eligible to vote to the nominated open source project. Then the project that got the most vote will receive the $10,000 US dollars for a year. So let's move on to my personal experience about Microsoft Inner Source. I've got a few open source projects I'm personally running, and one of them was transferred to Microsoft official product. So this is as a function project. It started as an open source project since 2016, and it has become one of the most popular serverless products of Azure cloud landscape. However, until late 2018, it delayed supporting Open API integration, which was de facto standard for like an API integration area. So there were a lot of requests to support the feature from the developer communities. But the product team didn't make a commitment when this feature would be available. So I started this project in late 2018 to fill the gap on Azure Functions service. So this is also an open source project. It initially started my personal and toy project, but it was rebranded in 2021 and has become an official Microsoft product. So what this extension does is that it automatically generates the OpenAPI document on the fly. And because of this extension, the Azure Functions API will have more improved discoverability by other applications, which is a really important feature in the service integration area and cloud native application development area. Because my extension got a lot of attentions from the developer community, the product team and I started discussion for migration in 2020. And finally, we completed those transfer in 2021. And right after that migration, it was introduced at Build conference as a key component for the service integration. Now this extension marks marks nearly 8.5 million downloads in total. And this extension is even used for semantic kernel, which is Microsoft's most popular AI agent SDK, which is equivalent to the LangChain. No, the breaking is enough. So what's the point of key takeaways while migrating this open source project to Microsoft? In terms of the inner source project, inner source point of view, there are some differences on the open source project policies between individual and organization. An open source project run by individuals have some level of freedom, but less structured. On the other hand, open source project run by organizations has less freedom, but highly structured. right? Both have goods and bads. So I wouldn't judge which is better for now. What about the sustainability perspective? So one of the most concerns using an open source project run by a few individuals is its sustainability. So if that open source project is no longer maintained, what will happen? In fact, I've got several open source projects solely run by myself. So if I am busy because of the work, those projects are not maintained for a while until I got some spare time. However, if that project is backed by a team of several people, then there are people other than myself. So these sort of concerns go away. And this is one of the benefits using inner source approach, which is integrate ability. So I can easily integrate the features with internal features by getting support from the product engineers. So if I am from outside, it won't be easier to integrate with these kind of the features with other products and services because of the numerous reasons. Another one, this was one of my key learnings. Sometimes a breaking change would be inevitable at some stage, right? And if we meet this situation, we must choose either dropping backward compatibility or keeping it compatible. Because Azure Functions is a platform service, it's really important to keep the backward compatibility at some stage. Personally, I learned a lot about this backward compatibility, like when to support, by when to support, from when to drop, what to keep, how to let developers know, and so on. So these learnings are based on the organization culture, and it was dissolved into our inner source culture. Yeah, so that concludes my talk today. So throughout this session, I discussed how Microsoft adopted the inner source approach to draw their recent innovation, and my personal learnings from that inner source culture to build an internal product and transfer from open source to the official product. Yep, that's it from me. Any questions? Right. Thanks for listening.
So, do we have any question from the audience? Okay.
Oh, that's a really good question. So if, as long as it's an open source project, yeah, so if it is an inner source project, that's an internal project, right? And we are running that inner source project as an open source way. That doesn't mean we are open that project to the public. Mm-hmm. Because they are all the internal Microsoft employees. Yeah. That depends. That depends, because I showed you before, like I'm the .NET Aspire. I'm not part of their team, but I contribute them every time. Almost whenever I found something that I raise an issue, and I put change some code base or something like that. Then they review it, and if they is the direction of what they are thinking, they merge it. If it's something different, they ask me to rewrite the code or reject based on the discussion, something like that. So it really depends. Yeah. Do you have an estimation percentage? Say again. An estimation percentage. So you can say like, well, almost 10% of the. Oh. 30% of our external. I have no idea. I don't have that number. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, the next one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for coming to the session. I'm Sachin Bhakar. I work for an energy company, and I'll be talking about inner source. So Justin, some time back, shared a lot of insights about inner source, but I will be giving more of, let's say, a high-level overview in the most simplest form. It's a 15-minute session, so there won't be any deep insights, but just a high level. Uh, just a second. Okay. So yeah, I have the simplest agenda. It's we'll start with what is inner source. We'll move to why, and then we'll figure out the how. The how is the difficult part. So we're just going to see it from a high-level overview, and just food for thought. How is the food for thought part? So what is inner source? So inner source is, you can say that it's more of an younger sibling of open source. Came into existence at a much later point of time. It walks on the same path. It follows most of the same way of open collaboration, open communication. And the quality is achieved through a separation of contribution. So it's just, I mean, Justin just said a lot of things, but few of the things is that I'm going to repeat is that lot of collaboration is going to happen within the company. It will imitate how open source cultures drive in the open source ecosystem. And we are just going to replicate all that. So inner source is nothing fancy. It's just whatever is happening in the open ecosystem, we are going to replicate the same within our company. So the code will not go out. So that's why there is no requirement of license. There is no requirement of CLAs. All those legal obligations are not required. And that's why inner source can actually accelerate development, can actually improve developer experience. And I'm going to talk a lot about in the how, in the why part. So yeah, I mean, it's 10 years, it came 10 years later. And the guidelines are just not really in place for most of the companies. So most of the developers, what they want to do is that they want to publish the code and put it into production and get done with it. Documentation is something where developers will shy away from it. So as long as the code is not well documented, others will not be able to contribute to it. Others will not be able to understand it, and they will just not be able to realize the power of that particular code. There are different inner source principles, the best practices that will also lack. And the last part is inner source rarely get support from management, high level, middle level management, because they don't see the value. And that's why it's really important to realize the how part. Okay, so now we'll talk about the why part. So most of the companies, and I would say high level management, will always listen to consultants or the consultancy companies. So Gartner has been talking about it a lot. And as you can see, just follow it doesn't look green, but so the green part, this is a Gartner hype cycle for software engineering year 2022 and 23. And what they're saying is that inner source is the innovation trigger for software development. And it's really at the beginning of it, and it will not plateau for the next 5 years, at least not for the 5 years. And this is really, I would say, an innovative element for any kind of development project. This one's from McKinsey, another consulting company. They are doing a lot of work in helping other technology companies how they can improve their developer experience. So McKinsey is not calling it inner source. McKinsey is calling it as developer experience. And so as you can see, this particular chart, developer is in the center of this particular developer experience. So what McKinsey is actually trying to do is that they have realized that inner source is built around a developer. around the requirements of the developer, and that's our main subject. It will require reusing existing capabilities, existing code. The program, the developer experience program needs to be evangelized. Everyone should be made aware of it, that there exists a certain kind of inner source or developer experience program. There should be a dedicated team for it, who's promoting it, who is managing it. Because without that management, without, I would say, deciding a flow of developer experience, it will not really work out. And yeah, the last one is decentralization of code contribution. So anyone should be able to contribute it. So if the code is open to anyone, so I mean, those who have worked in large MNCs, you'll realize that most of the code repositories, they are kept as private within the team. It is not made available for other people who are not part of the team. And that reduces any kind of contribution that it can get. So that's why it's really important to open the repository, at least for all the internal teams. Documentation is the next step. And from there on, any kind of conversation that is happening on, as Justin just showed, is that all the conversations were happening on the GitHub page. So anyone who's coming to see the code, who has seen the documentation, can just follow the conversation and can contribute. So these are the 5 things that will happen if a company is aiming for developer experience, for a good inner source program. It will attract talent, primarily because all the talented individuals wants to do is that they want to work on multiple kind of problems. They just don't want to stick to one project. They don't want to stick to one problem statement. They want to work on different problem statements and want to contribute on different projects also. There will be consistency, quality. So yeah, security and compliance has been mentioned by McKinsey, because the code is all internal. So one need not to be worried about license, whether it's Apache, whether it's GPL, because it's all internal, it's all proprietary. Again, here comes the tricky part in the third statement, is that if, let's just say, if it's a joint venture and the GitHub code repository company A and B, then there can be certain licensing obligations, because in joint venture, there will be an IP agreement which will decide that how the IP will be owned by the 2 companies. So it can get tricky in case of joint ventures, but if it's just one company, it's a solid program. Okay, so this, like the why part should make all the engineers, or I would say all the high-level management executives should feel like this kid. They should get excited. They should see that, okay, now we have realized the importance of it. How can we actually do it? How can we actually implement it? I would say this is the most important slide of my presentation, because this actually talks about how one can implement inner source. So there will be a vision, there will be a strategy, and there will be a roadmap on it. So vision will give us, I would say, the highest level of overview why we are doing a certain thing. So we want to leverage code reusability. We want to make sure that no engineer write a line of code that has already been written within the company. So the code reusability should be maximized. Developer experience should be improved. So no one wants to redo the work. No one wants to reinvent the wheel. If I would say, if a project is already available within a company, it should be made available for other teams, other projects. It should be a part of core strategy. So I agree that it will be implemented by engineers, but until unless it doesn't come from a top-down approach, until unless it's not evangelized by leaders, it will really not be a successful part, because every engineering team, they listen to their line managers, and their line manager listens to or to their skip level managers. So if they are promoting an inner source program, if they are saying that, okay, you have to document it, you have to make all your repositories open to other engineers, it will be done. So again, it's in the beginning, it will require a push from an upper level management, but later on it can become part of a culture, and then it will just happen on its own, that it's just going at a very steady pace. The last point is that it will attract talent, because any talented developer will get to work on different set of problems, and that's what they want to do. They just don't want to stick to one problem, stick to one project. Strategy will further, I would say, narrow down the vision to a more, I would say, solid action items. So one of the key features that is required to implement an inner source program is to have an inner source team. So it can be one individual, it can be 10, 15 individual. It will depend on the size of the company. There should be an alignment between research and development, legal and business function. So again, this will be part of the first few conversations that will happen when the InnerSource program is introduced. But later on, they need not to be in the loop. It will just be a conversation between different engineering teams. And the last one is to implement the vision, which will be a part of the strategy, is to have frameworks. So it's required to have certain kind of documentation processes. So again, it can be part of every team's KRA, that as soon as they develop they create a new repository, it should be public. I mean, at least for internally visible for all the people, and the documentation should be in well shape. There was one talk before the lunch, which was about how to make people excited about FOSS. And I can't recall the name of the speaker, but he actually compared a FOSS project with a movie title, and it actually made sense. Is that when we see a trailer of a movie, we get excited. We get excited because it is they are telling a story in a way that it will make you excited about the project. In a similar way, all the projects that are created internally, they needs to be well documented. There should be I would say, something to make people excited. And the last one, which is the roadmap, which is like the grassroots action items, is that there should be a tool or a dashboard to discover code. Now, let's say the InnerSource program is in place. Teams are actually using it. And if one of the engineers wants to find a project or wants to find a code, how he can do so. I mean, of course, GitHub repositories will let them do so, but if there is a dashboard, if there is a tool in place, in action, that can actually help them. So this will require a further, I would say, next level of automation, where code will be labeled, projects will be labeled with their functions, what the project will do, so that it will be easy for any developer to discover that particular code. The next one is code should be available, which I have been talking about from the beginning, is that no developer should, no project team should keep their code as private. And the last two are the basics, is like if the documentation is well in place, it will be easy to participate for any of the engineer. So what exactly is we are doing here is that we're just making a project accessible to all the engineers within the company. So yeah, I mean, this was, I would say, my session. I try to keep it very simple, considering the 15-minute slot. There was no point of going into the deep down strategies, but I would be happy to answer if there are any questions. If not, then I think I'll conclude there. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. So the next presentation is Guides, the General and Universal Image Data Evaluation System, a proposal of the emotional assessment platform using random images. Our speaker is Professor Yunio. Thank you very much.
Thank you for introduction. And thank you for coming to my session, and I'm very honored to be here in Hanoi. So I'd like to present the Guides, the General and Universal Image Data Evaluation System, a kind of emotional assessment platform we developed. Okay. Before starting my talk, let me introduce myself briefly. I'm a Jun Io from Chuo University, Japan. I'm a professor, and also I'm a board member of OSS Association Japan. And before I work for Chuo University, I used to work for Mitsubishi Research Institute. And my major is studies on the interaction between human and computers, human-machine interface. Let me start introduction of our system guides. As you know, digital not only digital but also analog images can strong power to convey information. Those visuals, photographs, and drawing, painting, and so on, enhance daily encounters, convey information, and elicit emotions. Therefore, recognize the impact of specific image is very important, and disgusting them from the other image is valuable activities for various applications like marketing investigation, product design, and of course, academic research we conducted. But the evaluation of the creative expression is a little bit complicated challenge. So, therefore, we decided to create such a kind of emotional assessment platform. This is the background of our research. We inspired by outstanding emotional research assessment of emojis conducted by Kutsuzawa and their colleagues, 2022. They conducted some researches of emojis. As you can see, these emojis are analyzed by two axes. Like x-axis is valence and the y-axis is arousal. Valence means the likelihood. Valence indicates what emojis you like, or if you don't like these emojis, you score the low valence. And if you like these, if you feel these emojis happy, you mentioned those emojis have high valence. On the other hand, arousal is kind of matrix of feeling, or the strongness of the impact. That means the high arousal emojis strong impact gives the strong impact, and low arousal emojis less power to convey some information. So inspired by their studies, we implemented a prototype of understanding user response to movie posters like this. That system shows 6 movie posters from a set of 100 movie posters, and the survey participants can evaluate their impression by two metrics using these sliders here. This is one of the results of our previous research. You can see high arousal and low, high valence and low arousal. You cannot see any movie posters. The valence and arousal on the movie posters have several weak correlations, but as mentioned previously, it's very interesting thing. We found that there are no posters who give low arousal score and high valence score. That is very impressive result of our previous research. Based on those findings, we enlarged the system titled Guides. Guides stands for General and Universal Image Evaluation System to accommodate image by incorporating administrative features tailored for those experiments. That means we can create some other experiment rather than movie posters. This session provides a simple overview of the system and emphasizing its capabilities, and I'd like to introduce some planned experimental use case. This is overview of the system. When the participants access the guide server, some list appears like this. This project list have an example project, another sample project, and distinction between blah, blah, blah. So if you are a registered user, you can create your own project like this, but participants of survey, we don't require to log in. That means research is open to public. As I mentioned, the system requires user account to create your own research project, but access to the evaluation page doesn't require the login process. That means they are open to public. The evaluation process consists of these 4 steps. The first step is showing informed consent information, and then the system provides introduction to the survey, and the main part is the evaluation process. After that, the result are coming up to the resulting page. Here is the screenshot of providing consent information description like here. Of course, you can, if you are a registered user, you can freely design this message, and of course, also the response message can configure as you like. If the participant of survey check this checkbox, the start button appears, and clicking this start button to proceed, by clicking this start button can proceed the survey to the next page. This is the second page. Second page shows the introduction to the assessment. The also the start evaluation button, clicking this button proceed the assessment to the evaluation page. Evaluation page is like this. Just like the assessment of movie posters, 6 images already, previous 6 images appears, accompanied with two sliders like this. The survey participant can evaluate the impression of each image. Of course, the evaluation scale can be configured by survey owners. These scales ranging from minus 1.0 to plus 1.0. Minus 1.0, it means the negative value, and 1.0 is positive values. After clicking submit button, oops. upon submitting the evaluation, the resulting page appears like this. Resulting page has a scatter plot like this. Red icons show blue icons. Blue icons implies your choice. That means if you score this on this image as oops, I cannot find this. So if you score this image, score here, your choice is coming here, and this image for your choice, and this image here, and so on. On the other hand, red icons are average of the other user's choice. So you can compare your result and the other's choice. This is the results are compared by in a scatter plot. Next, I'd like to talk about the administrative functions. As I mentioned, Guide is a versatile platform for emotionally assessing user responses to image. Registered user can create their own experiment. We have some configurable elements like this. Main configurable element is also, of course, target image, and descriptions is also configured as your own, as you like, including informed consent message. Of course, the informed consent message can be configured, and in addition, two-dimensional metrics like valence and arousal, you can configure some other metrics, likeness or something like that. After user, in order to create your own experiment, the system requires you to register your account. After user registration, the portal page appears, and the project includes a title, description, and description of the information consent, and two measurement titles. In addition, the project encompasses a collection of resources, but the system doesn't host the resource their own data. That means you have to put some image themselves. The other put on. You should such a resource put on the other platform. This system can only host the URLs. This is a project portal. This screenshot shows just after I logged in with my own account. User Jun use my page like here, and there you can see there are 3 projects like this. Of course, you can create a new project by clicking this button, and if you like, you can edit the project or discard it, or this icon means the launching the survey. if you click the edit icon, project editor comes up like this. So you can configure the name of the project like this, or description, consent information message, and exact title of two measurement, arousal or variance. These words can be changed, can be modified. And image data is like this. You can see several URLs of the target images. Project editor, you can configure some projects by project editor. Project editor can provide description metrics and the list of image data. Project designer must prepare the image data to be investigated elsewhere, as I mentioned previously. In addition, I'd like to emphasize that putting an image URL is some burden task, because if you analyze more than 100 data, you have to put in the URLs one by one. This is a little bit complicated and burden task. So the system allows that the image URLs can be configured collectively using an Excel file. If you note the image URLs in the Excel file, you can put such files to the system. The system can configure such URLs at one time. Of course, this is an event of open source FOSS. So our guide system is provided as open source software, and the source code is hosted by GitHub. If you can use our system, clicking this here and download and configure it to your server. This system is using Ruby 3.2.2 and Rails 7.08 and Bandra 2.4.15 and SQLite database. For the front end, Bootstrap, jQuery, and jQuery UI are used in our system. Configuration, please consult with the importmap.rb in detail. Installation is very simple. You can easily implement the guide system on your server following these 3 steps, just 3 steps. Git clone from the GitHub and the Bandra update, and start the server with Rails server commands. Well, do I have time to demonstrate? 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, this is the assessment page. This is open to public, and this doesn't need logged in. So an example project, and I'd like to check OK to consent form and start assessment. So some description appears here, and I'd like to click start evaluation. So you can you can evaluate these 6 images. If you feel this image gives me high arousal and low valence, low arousal and low valence, high arousal and high valence, low arousal, blah blah blah, like this. Okay, and submit it. So the result comes up like this. Okay, this is a simple demonstration. Let's go back to the explanation. Okay, let me conclude my talk. This session introduced the system for the emotional evaluation system entitled GUIDES. GUIDES stands for General and Universal Image Data Evaluation System, and its origin is the research focusing of user response to movie posters. The novel system GUIDES allows registered user to create your own experimental project using an open evaluation processes comprising information content, introduction, evaluation, and the result page. The final issue is future work. We research team now planning to conduct several experiments like this. Sensitivity evaluation to distinguish between human-created image and machine-created image. Machine-generated image, that means, as you know, AI-generated image. For example, stable diffusion or something like that. So we have to figure out whether we can figure out such images or not. Or the other student is considering to evaluate fashion item for fashionability and likabilities, focusing on understanding preference across different age groups. These are a very interesting project. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Tôi là Tuấn. Tôi sẽ trình bày cái bài của tôi bằng tiếng Việt. Thì hy vọng là sẽ truyền tải được nhiều nội dung thông tin hơn đến cho tất cả mọi người. Firstly, I would like to apologize to English speaker here. I would like to present my slide by Vietnamese for better understanding for other people. So sorry. Chắc hẳn là mọi người đều nghe nói, tại vì từ 2 hôm nay chúng ta nói rất nhiều đến câu chuyện phần mềm nguồn mở, công nghệ mở và tương đối nhiều các loại thứ mở khác nhau. Thì ở đây chúng ta phải nhớ là cái cộng đồng phần mềm nguồn mở Việt Nam ấy đã hình thành và phát triển được hơn 20 năm nay rồi. Và mình ở đây ấy, mình cũng đã có gần 30 năm làm việc trong những cái thứ hỗn độn này về các thứ mở rồi. Thế thì mình muốn chia sẻ với các bạn một bài rất là basic. Mặc dù rất là basic nhưng mà mình nghĩ là luôn luôn cần cho tất cả, đặc biệt là các bạn trẻ, các bạn sinh viên, là về cái hệ thống giấy phép mở, open licensing. Tại vì phần nguồn mở thì mình nhấn mạnh một cái điểm đầu tiên ấy, để mọi người lưu ý là gọi là phần nguồn mở, gọi là những cái thứ công nghệ mở nói chung ấy, thì không phải là cái gì thích làm gì làm. Mở không có nghĩa là thích làm gì làm, mà mở nó cũng có những hệ thống quy tắc nó chỉ khác các cái thứ nguồn đóng ấy, là nó hướng đến câu chuyện là mở cho mọi người. Nhưng mà nó có những cái quy tắc mà khi chúng ta sử dụng nguồn mở để chúng ta xây dựng những cái hệ thống, những cái sản phẩm của chúng ta chẳng hạn, hoặc là sử dụng công nghệ mở, thiết kế mở, rồi rất nhiều cái thứ mở khác sắp tới các bạn sẽ được tiếp cận ấy, thì nó đều có các quy tắc chung hết. Và ở đây tôi chỉ muốn tập trung vào cái thứ đầu tiên và cái thứ rất là sơ khai, có từ nhiều chục năm nay ấy, đấy là phần nguồn mở đã. Còn những cái thứ liên quan đến các thứ mở khác nữa ấy, thì các bạn chắc là sẽ còn phải tìm hiểu nhiều nữa. Và nếu các bạn mà muốn tìm hiểu chuyên sâu về khoa học mở, về tài nguyên giáo dục mở ấy, thì ở đây có anh Lê Trung Nghĩa là một người rất là nghiên cứu rất là chuyên sâu về các câu chuyện về mở. Nói chung là anh có một cái blog riêng về nguồn mở, về tất cả những thứ mở đấy, Open Science và Open Educational Resources. Đấy, thì tất cả những cái câu chuyện đấy là chúng ta sẽ tìm hiểu dần trong cái bài hôm nay. Tôi muốn đi qua rất nhanh thôi. Thứ nhất là tôi muốn chia sẻ cho các bạn là các hệ thống về giấy phép mở. Quan điểm về thế giới và nguồn mở thì thôi chắc là vì trong khuôn khổ là cái sự kiện này tôi cũng chỉ có bài nói 15 phút và tôi cũng vừa giới thiệu nhanh chắc là 3-4 phút 5 phút rồi, cho nên là tôi sẽ bỏ qua phần 1. Các bạn tìm các bài của tôi có thể xem thêm. Tôi sẽ tập trung vào câu chuyện là các hệ thống về giấy phép mở, các hệ thống về giấy phép tài liệu mở và một số các vấn đề liên quan. Vấn đề quan điểm thì phần nguồn mở có rất nhiều quan điểm nổi tiếng, nhưng mà chúng ta có 10 quan điểm mà nổi tiếng nhất tôi chia sẻ trong bài của tôi, thì tôi sẽ cố gắng là lướt qua nhanh thôi. Các bạn có thể xem lại cái bài này trong kỷ yếu của tổ chức. Thế còn các hệ thống về giấy phép mở ấy, thì các cái phần mềm nguồn mở và phần mềm sở hữu quyền ấy, thì đều có giấy phép cả, chứ không phải là phần mềm nguồn mở là không có giấy phép nhá. Phần mềm mở là phần mềm có giấy phép, nhưng mà giấy phép của nó hướng đến những cái câu chuyện là mở. Và giấy phép, hệ thống giấy phép của phần mở thì nó có chia thành 2 cái nhóm mà được 2 tổ chức lớn trên thế giới họ đồng ý. Đấy là Free Software Foundation và Open Source Initiative. Hầu hết các giấy phép lớn trên thế giới, giấy phép chính trên thế giới đều được 2 cái tổ chức đấy approve cả. Còn một số giấy phép thì chỉ được FS, hoặc là một số giấy phép thì chỉ được OSI approve thôi, nhưng mà hầu hết là đều được cả 2 tổ chức approve cả. Thì những cái giấy phép đấy là được 2 tổ chức này bảo vệ trên khắp thế giới. Và nếu các bạn mà làm một cái phần mềm nguồn mở, các bạn quyết định là phát hành thêm một giấy phép do Free Software Foundation approve chẳng hạn, thì các luật sư của Free Software Foundation sẽ đứng ra bảo vệ cho những phần mềm nguồn mở của các bạn, để những cái cá nhân khác, những cái tổ chức trên thế giới là không thể vi phạm cái giấy phép đấy của các bạn. Đấy. Ngược lại là các bạn nhìn thấy một cái phần mềm nguồn mở mà nó đã được phát hành dưới một giấy phép của các tổ chức này đưa ra, thì các bạn cũng sẽ cần phải đọc và tuân thủ theo cái giấy phép đấy. Đấy. Có đến khoảng độ 70 loại giấy phép khác nhau thôi. Các bạn sẽ nghe nói đến một số loại giấy phép. Tôi sẽ nói dần từng cái. Ví dụ như cái loại giấy phép mà các bạn nghe nhiều nhất là cái GPL này, đúng không? Đây, cái ông GPL này, General Public License. Chắc là nếu như nghiên cứu về nguồn mở thì đây là một trong giấy phép mà phổ biến nhất. Một trong những cái phổ biến nhất bây giờ. Thì trong giấy phép này, thay vì các giấy phép của cái phần mềm sở hữu quyền ấy, người ta yêu cầu là người sử dụng là cấm không được làm việc A, cấm không được làm việc B, cấm không được làm việc C, cấm. Thì giấy phép phần nguồn mở nó làm ngược lại. Nó trong đấy nó sẽ ghi là nó cho phép người sử dụng được làm những cái gì, và yêu cầu là người sử dụng là, và ngay cả người phát triển khi mà đã phát hành phần nguồn mở theo cái giấy phép đấy là đã đồng ý cái câu chuyện là cho người sử dụng là được. Ví dụ GPL là được 4 cái quyền tự do này. Tự do sử dụng này. Khi bạn thấy một cái phần mềm mà nó được phát hành theo giấy phép GPL, các bạn yên tâm là các bạn lấy dùng thoải mái, chả ai cấm. Tại vì nó được ghi là tự do sử dụng rồi. Tự do phân phối, tức là bạn cầm cái phần mềm đó, các bạn copy, các bạn tặng cho người khác thoải mái. Nếu như phần mềm sở hữu độc quyền thì không được như thế. Các bạn mua một phần mềm sở hữu độc quyền cầm vào trong tay, các bạn đi tặng người khác một cái là các bạn vi phạm ngay. Trong giấy phép nó ghi là các bạn không được đưa cho ai cả, chỉ một mình các bạn dùng thôi. Thậm chí còn strictly đến đoạn là các bạn chỉ được dùng trong một cái máy tính đấy thôi. Nếu mà máy bên cạnh các bạn mà mua cái máy khác, có thể các bạn phải mua một phiên bản mới, chứ không hề là được dùng nhá, không được phân phối. Cái thứ ba là tự do sửa đổi theo nhu cầu sử dụng. Các bạn nhìn thấy một cái phần mềm được phát hành theo giấy phép GPL, các bạn yên tâm là các bạn lấy mã nguồn về, các bạn sửa thoải mái, chẳng ai cấm cả, không ai hạn chế các bạn cái quyền sửa nó. Và cuối cùng là tự do phân phối lại cái bản sửa đổi nhá. Tức là bạn sửa xong rồi các bạn có thể phát cho người khác được, phát cái bản origin rồi nhưng mà phát luôn cả bản sửa đổi được thoải mái. Đấy. Thì tất cả những quyền tự do này là giấy phép mở ấy, nó sẽ quy định những cái chuyện là các bạn được làm gì, chứ không phải là quy định cái chuyện là cấm các bạn làm gì. Ngược lại, ông sở hữu độc quyền là chỗ đấy. Tất nhiên hệ thống giấy phép mở như tôi vừa có trên slide có khoảng 70 loại giấy phép mà được Free Software Foundation hoặc là Open Source Initiative approve, thì nó là một cái mớ rất dài dòng, và câu chuyện đấy là câu chuyện của các luật sư. Chúng ta chỉ cần nhớ một vài các loại giấy phép chính ấy, và chúng ta khi làm chúng ta có thể là làm theo giấy phép đấy. Tôi có một vài anh bạn ở ngoài kia mới quen sáng thì các anh là Only Office, các anh ý phát hành giấy phép của anh theo giấy phép là AGPL, là một cái thứ còn mở hơn cả cái GPL này nữa. AGPL là Afro, cái đấy nó còn yêu cầu một cái thứ là nếu các bạn mà đã mang cái phần mềm các bạn đưa lên cloud ấy, thì nó cũng phải là mở cho tất cả những người sử dụng. Mở nhá, mọi người đừng nói đến chuyện miễn phí nhá. Ở đây không có câu chuyện miễn phí nhá. Ở đây tôi chỉ nói đến mở thôi nhá. Miễn phí như kiểu là các bạn có một cái ly bia trong tay để các bạn uống là câu chuyện khác hẳn nhá. Free trong cái thuật ngữ free software ấy, nó là tự do, chứ không phải free software là phần mềm miễn phí nhá. Phần mềm miễn phí là một cái thứ khác hẳn, tôi không nói đây nhá. Rồi, ok. Vừa rồi tôi nói đến GPL thì bây giờ chúng ta phải nói đến một cái một cái giấy phép khác, một cái dòng giấy phép khác. GPL là đại diện cho cái dòng giấy phép là giấy phép mạnh, còn đại diện cho một cái dòng giấy phép khác là giấy phép dễ dãi, là giấy phép BSD hoặc là MIT. Thì cái giấy phép này nó như này, tức là nó trao quyền tự do đến cho lập trình viên. Còn giấy phép trao dòng mạnh nó trao quyền tự do đến cho người sử dụng. Trao quyền tự do đến lập trình viên nghĩa là sao? Một trong những cái phần mềm mà nổi tiếng nhất, được dùng rộng rãi nhất bây giờ mà theo giấy phép BSD ấy, các bạn biết, có thể trong phòng này các bạn sẽ đang dùng rồi. Đấy, iOS. iOS là phát triển dựa trên một cái phần mềm mà theo giấy phép BSD. Gốc của nó là một cái phần mềm theo giấy phép BSD, và nó trao quyền cho người lập trình viên ấy. Tức là khi mà bạn thấy một cái phần mềm mà được phát hành theo giấy phép BSD, bạn có quyền cầm cái phần mềm đấy về, bạn sửa thoải mái, bạn đóng lại, bạn không mở nữa. Thế nhưng mà giấy phép BSD nó yêu cầu là bạn phải công nhận là tôi dựa trên cái phần mềm gốc là gì, tên tác giả gốc là gì. Đấy. Thì giấy phép này dễ dãi, nó trao quyền cho lập trình viên, nhưng không có nghĩa là nó hoàn toàn muốn làm gì làm. Mà nếu bạn đã sửa một phần mềm dựa trên giấy phép BSD ấy, thì bạn phải ghi công tác giả. Đấy. Tác giả nó chỉ cần mỗi ghi công thôi, nó không cần giữ cái gì cả. Đấy. Thì iOS là được dựa trên một số các thứ NetBSD, FreeBSD, rồi một số các phần mềm có tên tương tự. Đây, giấy phép mạnh tôi vừa nói rồi, thì đại diện là GPL. Còn có một kiểu là bạn có thể phân phối phần mềm của chính bạn. Giấy phép này là ai quyết định? Là người tác giả đầu tiên của cái phần mềm đấy, đúng không? Ví dụ tôi viết dòng code đầu tiên, tôi bảo là cái phần mềm của tôi tên là Tuấn chẳng hạn, và tôi yêu cầu tôi bảo là tôi sẽ phát hành phần mềm Tuấn dưới cái giấy phép là ví dụ là GPL chẳng hạn, thì đấy tôi là người quyết định. Ai là người tác giả phần mềm gốc đầu tiên thì người đấy là người quyết định là sẽ phát hành phần mềm đấy theo giấy phép nào. Và tất cả những người sau đấy đi theo ấy, chỉ có tuân thủ theo thôi. Nếu các bạn thấy phần mềm của tôi tốt, các bạn muốn sử dụng nó thì các bạn phải đọc giấy phép mà tôi đang đưa ra. JBL hay BSD hay MIT hay bất kỳ thứ gì mà tôi đưa ra, thì các bạn tuân thủ theo nó, các bạn sẽ được dùng của các bạn. Không tuân thủ theo nó là tôi sẽ tước quyền của các bạn hết. Trong giấy phép của tôi sẽ ghi là nếu các bạn không tuân thủ theo giấy phép này thì các bạn tự động bị tước hết tất cả các quyền. Đấy là cái nhóm các giấy phép thì tôi có quyền là tôi tuyên bố là tôi phát hành phần mềm của tôi dưới 2, 3 hay 5 giấy phép kệ tôi. Khi tôi là tác giả chính thì tôi muốn làm gì làm thì tôi có thể là gọi là dual license hoặc triple license hay như nào đấy, thì có thể mix nhiều giấy phép với nhau. Thế thì ở đây tôi chia sẻ với bạn thêm một cái nữa để cho các bạn hình dung ra thêm, là trong câu chuyện mà phần mềm nguồn mở rồi rất nhiều thứ mở trên đời thì nó có một cái quan trọng, đấy là tài liệu mở. Khi bạn mà có trong tay một cái tài liệu trong tay, các bạn phải đọc xem là người ta cho phép các bạn làm cái gì trên đấy, thì nó có một cái thứ gọi là Creative Commons để gán giấy phép cho tài liệu mở. Chính bản thân cái slide này của tôi cũng là đang theo giấy phép Creative Commons. Tức là bạn nhìn vào đây, các bạn cầm cái tài liệu, cầm cái slide này của tôi sử dụng như nào là nó được quy định trong cái giấy phép phát hành đúng cái slide này. Được chưa? Thế thì trong giấy phép Creative Commons thì nó chia thành các cấp độ khác nhau, từ hạn chế rất ít, tức là muốn làm gì làm ở public domain này, đến hạn chế nhiều nhất là online reserve, đấy như kiểu mấy ông sở hữu độc quyền kìa. Ở dưới là một dài thì trong đấy nó có là tôi chỉ cần các bạn yêu cầu các bạn là ghi công thôi, hoặc là tôi yêu cầu các bạn là vừa ghi công lại vừa phải share cho mọi người giống như tôi, tức là bạn giống như bản gốc. Tôi yêu cầu là vừa ghi công mà lại vừa là không được đem đi kinh doanh, đem nội dung này của tôi đi kinh doanh, ví dụ thế. Vừa ghi công vừa không được kinh doanh, lại vừa share like, để nó lại là nó có 6 các độ khác nhau. Thì khi tôi là người viết ra đầu tiên cái nội dung này, tôi có quyền là ra quyết định là tôi sẽ viết nội dung này dưới cái giấy phép nào. Thế nhưng mà nếu tôi là người đi lấy, thực tế mà nói, tôi lấy rất nhiều nội dung này của các siêu nhân trên đời chứ không phải tôi tự nghĩ ra được hết, thì trong đấy sẽ có một siêu nhân mà tôi vừa giới thiệu đầu tiên là anh Nghĩa. Anh ấy có rất nhiều nội dung ở đây, và khi mà anh ấy đã yêu cầu là CC by SA rồi thì cái tài liệu này của tôi cũng phải tuân theo như thế. Chứ nếu mà tôi làm lại ngược lại là anh nghĩ anh sẽ tước ngay cái quyền của tôi lập tức tại thời điểm bây giờ. Ví dụ thế. Thì tất cả những cái câu chuyện này thì các bạn cũng tóm lại ấy, là khi các bạn tiếp cận với cả phần mềm do nguồn mở này, tài liệu mở này, tài nguyên giáo dục mở này, khoa học mở này, công nghệ mở này, thiết kế mở, và hâm và lằng rất nhiều thứ mở trên đời, là bây giờ gần như mọi thứ trên đời này đều có cái phiên mở, và cái phiên mở đấy bây giờ là xu hướng chung của toàn thế giới rồi. Thì các bạn luôn luôn sẽ kèm theo một cái tài sản mở đấy, thì nó kèm theo một cái bộ giấy phép đi kèm, nó tuyên bố là người cầm cái tài sản mở đấy được quyền làm những gì. Đấy, thì khi các bạn mà sử dụng phần mềm nguồn mở để các bạn phát triển sản phẩm của mình chẳng hạn, các bạn cố gắng là việc đầu tiên các bạn mở ra xem là cái phần mềm nguồn mở mình có trong tay nó phát hành cho giấy phép nào, để các bạn tuân thủ được đúng các cái quy định mà tác giả gốc người ta yêu cầu. Còn khi các bạn là tác giả gốc, các bạn được viết một cái phần mềm từ những dòng code đầu tiên ấy, thì các bạn tự do là các bạn quyết định xem là cái sản phẩm đấy của các bạn là theo giấy phép nào, phát hành theo giấy phép nào, để cho cả thế giới được dùng như nào. Đấy, thoải mái. Các bạn là tác giả gốc đầu tiên mà, đúng không? Thì khi mà mình là tác giả gốc đầu tiên, mình tự quyết định được là cái license của mình ấy, thì tôi cũng rất là khuyến khích các bạn là hãy phát hành theo giấy phép mở. Tại vì trải nghiệm của tôi hơn 20 năm nay khi đi làm tất cả các thứ trên đời về IT ấy, thì tôi thấy là nếu làm theo cái phương pháp mở ấy, thì những cái đóng góp của mình có thể mới đầu mình bật lên chỉ là một hạt cát thôi, nhưng mà đến lúc mà có cộng đồng đóng góp vào thì cái hạt cát ấy biến thành một cái đại dương rất là lớn. Đấy, thì đấy là chia sẻ của tôi ngày hôm nay. Thì xin phép là các bạn English speaker đã được nói tiếng Việt, và rất mong là chia sẻ tiếp rất nhiều các cái chủ đề này với các bạn sinh viên và những người đang làm trong ngành IT. Và tôi xin hết ạ. Có câu hỏi gì không ạ? Thực ra là nó cũng không hẳn có một cái license nào ghét nhất, mà tại vì mình phải đi theo người ta để mình làm nữa mà. Mình có hai lựa chọn: một là mình lấy một dự án nguồn mở ra mình xem và mình làm theo, hai là mình tự làm ra một dự án nguồn mở mới. Thế thì cái thứ ghét nhất của anh ấy, nó là cái thứ mà nó lại nửa nạc nửa mỡ. Ví dụ nhá, anh lấy ví dụ luôn nhá. Anh tham gia vào một cái dự án nguồn mở tên là Zimbra từ những ngày đầu tiên năm 2004. Thì hồi đấy nó là dual license, là một license GPL, một license là ZPL. ZPL là Zimbra Public License. Tên nó nghe có vẻ mở nhưng không phải. Cái license đấy không được FSF và OSI approve, và nó trong đấy nó quy định nhiều thứ chéo ngoe. Sau đấy thì cái dự án đấy nó sợ quá, nó bị nhiều người tẩy chay phản đối quá, nên nó phải dẹp cái license ZPL nên nó quay sang license là CPAL. Tức là nó vẫn lùa license là GPL và CPL, và khi nó chuyển phát là bao nhiêu người đóng góp vào, lao vào đông đủ ngay. Còn lúc trước là cứ gạt tránh. Sau đấy thì nó lại xoay thì dần dần thì nói chung cộng đồng thế giới nó nhanh lắm. Tức là ví dụ như là MySQL định đóng một phát là MariaDB nó mọc ra ngay. LibreOffice lại mọc ra sau OpenOffice, đúng không? Thậm chí bây giờ có ông OnlyOffice ngoài kia nữa. Ví dụ thế, rất nhiều. Thế cho nguồn mở nó là một cái thứ mà ngày xưa đại ca gì của Microsoft anh quên mất tên rồi, Steve Ballmer, đại ca bảo là nguồn mở là cái căn bệnh ung thư. Tại vì nó di căn nhanh quá, nó đẻ ra nhanh quá. Nếu như ông đóng ở chỗ này thì nó phòi ra chỗ khác, và không thể cản được cái dòng chảy, và không thể cản được cái cuộc cách mạng nguồn mở. Và bây giờ thực tế mà nói là nguồn mở đã everywhere rồi, không cần phải bàn đến câu chuyện là có được nguồn mở hay không. Rồi, xin phép mọi người, anh hết giờ rồi.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome to my talk for FOSSASIA Summit 2024, and today I'll be talking about a primer on open source licensing. Before I start, I would like to introduce myself. I am Shubhendra and I work as a developer advocate at Cash-Free Payments. Cash-Free Payments is India's one of the leading payments and API banking company. And I'm also a Mozilla representative, and I help local tech communities to contribute to Mozilla and open source. And I have been a GitHub campus expert. I also curate a newsletter for open source called ossbytes.dev. So today I'm going to talk about why choose an open source license, why do we use a license, and what is the value of that, and what are open source licenses, what they are, what do they mean, and what impact they have on open source project. And finally, how to choose the right open source license. So the right is in double quotes there because it is not going to be same for everybody. Now the caveat of all of this is that I am not a lawyer. And why mentioning this is important, because intellectual property has intellectual property is a big deal, and the license that you choose for a project has a big impact on that. So the information that I'm going to give you, while it is going to be informative and helpful for choosing a project, so if you are ever in a legal dispute, you can't just talk about this one guy you met at FOSSASIA told you about this. It's just not gonna fly out. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a helpful developer to all other developers. Now, the other important statement I want to make to set this presentation all up is that code is art. And I don't mean it because I'm a developer who writes code and loves staring at the algorithms. I mean it from the legal perspective. All the code you write is considered as a creative work. It's the same thing as writing a book, producing a song, or producing a painting. So when you write a piece of code, it's considered as an artistic piece of work. And this is important to know because just like you produce a song or write a book, you own on it what's known as copyright. So the same thing is with all the code that you write. As soon as you write the line of code, you are the copyright owner. You are the sole owner of that property. Well, what is copyright? It actually goes back to the saying that you are the owner uh, and only you have the right to produce the copies and distribute the copies of your work. So in terms of software, what this means is that let's say you write the code, and the moment you write the code, it's yours. So you have the copyright and you are the sole owner. So you have the right to say to person A and B to use your code in their project in whatever means they want to do. But person A can't go to these two people and give away your code for using or distributing it. They will have to come back to you, and because you are the copyright owner of your work. So copyright protects your legal right to control who can distribute and alter your software. Now that's great, and it may be useful in some cases, but in other cases in the world today, it may not be useful, because what copyright also does, as it comes with limitations. So such as when you write code, it is automatically copyrighted. Only you get to define how it is going to be used. So let's say for the sake of this presentation, you wrote a software for GPS navigation, and what if that software could be used for autonomous vehicles? And what if it could be applied to rocket ships that could self-land like SpaceX? If you're not thinking of these use cases while writing your software, then you're probably not helping solving these problems. And it's going to be used for only one thing that you are going to define it for. Also, when your code is copyrighted, only you get to add improvements to it. So again, we have a software for GPS navigation, and let's say you want to add a GUI on top of it. You can make improvements, or you can add more code to it because you're the copyright holder. But let's say someone else were to come along and say, hey, I was using this software and I think this will be a great improvement to your software. They really can't contribute to it. That's unfortunate, because you are the copyright owner of your work, and the code that they will write, they will be the copyright owner of their code. So there's this whole gray area where you put their copyrighted code in your copyrighted code, then who owns the copyright? So that's how legal disputes happen. So with this idea of being copyrighted code or using it as or making it open source, I always go back to this one question. As developers, we need to ask for ourselves, like, why do we write software? So I'm sure most of you are gonna agree, like, with what I'm going to say now. So we came up with an idea that there is a problem in the world, and we want to fix it or make it better. So we write software as developers to fix the world's problem. And that's great. But we only have so much insight into the world and the problem that they have. So by open sourcing our software, we make our software available to the world, and they can contribute or improve it. So we can say that, hey, I produced this software which is fixing this problem or improving it. And after making it open source, the rest of the world can say, oh yeah, then this is how you can improve it. So it actually allows us to build the software that changes the world and opens it up to everybody. Now I want to talk a little bit about what open source means. So there's this idea that open source means software is free. No, just because you open source your software doesn't mean it has to be given away for free. When you can open source your software and still make money out of it. Tons of companies do it. Open source means inviting others to contribute to your code and improve on it. And this is why I'll get into why we should use open source licenses, so that you can protect your intellectual property and which is the creative work or code that you write. Now let's talk about the licenses in general. Licenses comes with the rights and obligations. Rights are the things that a person is allowed to do, and obligations are the things that person should follow while using your software. Now, what is open source license? Open source license basically dictates the terms and conditions that comes with the use of open source software, basically the rights and obligations. It serves as a legal agreement between the author of the open source and the user of the open source software. So author makes the open source software available with certain guidelines that the user must follow. But what if I don't apply an open source license? In that case, whoever contributes to your project, be it code, content, or graphics, whether it is a minor contribution, that contributor becomes the exclusive copyright holder of their work. And nobody can use or modify their code or content. And that nobody includes you. An open source license should allow the software to be freely used, modified, or distributed by establishing certain guidelines. And these guidelines are rights and obligations. And if it is not there, then it's not really open source. So there's this misunderstanding among new developers that if they just release their project on GitHub, then it becomes open source. No, GitHub gives us an option to like make our project public or private, but just simply releasing your project publicly on GitHub is not same as licensing your project. If you want others to use, modify, distribute, or contribute to your project, then you should include a right license in your project. So there are a lot of licenses available, and these are the most commonly used licenses that are used by popular open source projects. If you are starting from the blank slate, MIT, it's hard to go wrong with the MIT license. So it's very short, easy to understand, and allows anyone to do anything with the project as long as they are keeping the copy of license and your copyright notice. So if you use MIT, you are also allowed to change the license in future if you ever need to do. Apache 2.0 and GPL v3 are the other popular licenses, but there are other options to choose from. You can find the full text of these licenses and instructions of how to use them on choosealicense.com. So till now we have licenses for code, but what if the creative content is not code, but a graphics or a video? So there's this organization called Creative Commons. They provide a suite of licenses for such creative work. YouTube, Wikipedia, Wikimedia, Vimeo, they use licenses from Creative Commons. So Creative Commons also provide a license chooser. You can visit this website, creativecommons.org/choose, and choose a license for your creative work if it's not code. So to conclude, if you ever need to make your project an open source, you will need to add an open source license on your project. Luckily, there is an organization called Open Source Initiative, and they have been around since 1998. All they do is like evaluate open source licenses and approve or deny them. There are around 200 open source licenses, and 100 of them are approved by Open Source Initiative. So you can check them out at opensource.org/licenses. Now, finally, I can't for your project, but I can definitely tell you the guidelines that you can follow to select the right license for your open source project. First and foremost, use the license approved by OSI, Open Source Initiative. Second, read the license before you use it. So this can be a hard one because all the licenses are written in legalese, and none of us are lawyers. So there's a fun website called tldrlegal.com. You can just visit that website, select a license, and all the licenses, terms, and conditions are written in basic English terms. So you can quickly have a glance at what that license provides. And most important thing, do not change your license once released. And this is for as per version of your software. Let's say you released version 1 of your software with some weak license, and then in future you want to have more control over your license or software, then you decide to change the license, then you cannot do it on version 1 of your software. You need to release another version, maybe V2, and then only you can change the license on it. And this is why, because when you open source your software, it is assumed that someone has already copied or made some changes to your project that has initial license on it. So with that, it ends. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and feel free to ask any questions if you have any related to open source or open source licensing. And you guys can visit my website at camelkillsky.com. Anyone has any questions?
Do we have any questions? Okay, yeah. Maybe.
Thank you. So I found a lot of projects on GitHub that have like copyleft license. So I want to ask, like, what is the difference between the copyright license and the copyleft license?
That's a good question. Open source licenses are basically divided into two, permissive and copyleft. So copyleft basically arrived from the copyright, like it's the opposite of copyright. So what permissive licenses does, they allows the user of your open source software to use whatever license they want. Like let's say you create a software with the MIT license, right? I want to use another license on my project that is a fork of your project. So I can use, if I'm like you're using permissive license, but if you're using copyleft licenses on your project, I can't use. There are certain guidelines that I have to follow, including the license that you have already put up on your project. So you'll have to go into deep, like what are the differences between copyleft and permissive, but that's a broad overview difference between them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So our next presenter, actually, it's not on the agenda, but our next presenter is Dan, and Dan will be talking like from Python to Golang, right? That's the title? Okay. So if you are interested in the topic, feel free to stay in the room.
Hi guys, Daniel here. So I mentioned about why in universities often Python is taught, and then there are better opportunities here for something maybe that can be used in production. All right, so Python has like a history since about 2000. One of the kind of key things is it's been like widely used. It's available for easy download, and of course comes installed in most distros. So it is of course very widely used. Also, it's of course well documented. One of the key things is like it's actually has excellent documentation, meaning that it's easy to understand and of course employ. It's of course fairly easy to use. There are fewer ways of doing things, which actually makes things really, really easy understanding, of course, and using it, unlike Perl, by example. It's also a memory-safe language, so that there isn't any security issues with like using data after being freed. So it has like a bunch of benefits to it. Also, there are some issues as well with that. So it's in production at large scale. It often has like large memory usage. So that leads to like out of memory crashing on your like hosting or any containers. Also, it's not so efficient with a CPU usage, mainly because it's JIT compiled. And so it's a kind of like doing a like very quick compilation step, so it can't be as heavily optimized. Also, many of you probably also experience issues with versioning and dependencies. This, of course, is like a kind of major problem these days. One solution is to have either Python environment, which is like a kind of copy of all libraries, or like some vendors ship the whole Python release as well, like mainly for like ensuring no issues or compatibility problems. Also, so its types are inferred at runtime, so you can change like any type of any variable. That, of course, creates problems with compilation and also verification. So there are some problems which that introduces, making it kind of easier. So I'd say that Python is like an excellent learning tool, but also in production, say in cloud services, it could be like a bad choice. So how do therefore we define an excellent choice? So what goals do we have which help us navigate which choice, which like language is an excellent choice? So I'd say there are like 5 areas here. We have, of course, the developers here. So also perhaps people who would use the APIs. Sorry, language mechanisms. Of course, is it well documented? Are there any possible security issues? Also, support from the actual language itself. So, of course, some languages have less support than others. Also, going forward, is there any API guarantees? So, if in like say 10 years, if you compile your like your code, will it compile? So these are some of these elements which we should evaluate for a certain language. Fortunately, one of the more recent languages, Golang, that's now about 12 years old. It actually has a lot of these benefits. What I'll do is I'll run through some examples so you can see fairly easily what you can do with Golang. I'd say that it's also designed with like a network, cloud connectivity and like repos and APIs in mind. Okay, so how do you run things in parallel in Golang? So as you can see, this operator here called Go is you can actually add that in front of a like function call, and then it'll actually run separate from any like code execution here. So in program order, you'd see that hello is called before world here. So like you of course would expect hello world as the output. But then when you actually run it, it's of course in the reverse, because hello is called in parallel with like world, and actually so executes later on. So what you can do is you can like scan the QR code, and then you can also like run the code yourself. So these like routines are called Go routines. They actually are like scheduled onto the like a processor cores. So it's like a kind of very efficient means of like scheduling thousands or up to like millions of like small functions or calls. That could be useful, like say for like processing like requests or like work units at scale. Okay, next up we have how do you use other modules in Go? Actually, all you have to do is reference the actual repo here. So you'll in this example, you will just simply mention this package called like Go figure on GitHub, and then you can actually use this directly in the code. And so here, what we do here is we then instantiate like a kind of object called figure, and then we like pass in some strings here, and then we call the function on that print. So when you build this with with the command go build or go run, it'll fetch that package and also any packages that one uses as well. So it's like very efficient, very easy. So when you go run main.go, you will have the output. Once again, you can scan the QR code and then you can see the actual example. So it's very very simple actually. With of course this, you can you can build like big projects very fast. Okay, so say you have some code that you want to test. Now, obviously, unit tests are like very important. It's also very easy overlooking like adding tests as you actually write code. So in this case, we're looking at like factorials here. So factorial is the sum of all integers from the value that you pass. So how can we add a test for this? So you simply add a file with underscore test suffix there, and then you have a prefix here, test, before the function. And then what you can do is simply type go test, and it'll compile this unit test here and execute all unit tests. In this case, the test runs, all good, but then it actually finds that the value we expect is not correct. And that's because we should be including the top value in the loop. Should be less than or equals to. So actually really useful. You can have hundreds of tests. They can run either in series or in parallel. You can annotate them. Okay, so say you want to fetch a resource from the internet. So this in fact illustrates some of the power of Go. So in this case, we want to fetch a kind of joke string from an API. What we do is we have this HTTPS link here, and then simply this code is very simple. It will generate a HTTP request, a HTTP GET. Of course, it performs all the handshaking with SSL, so everything is checked and secure. And then it will pass the JSON into a struct here defined, which has the JSON elements. At that point, it then here what we do, this struct here actually has two elements, so we can actually define a function based on that struct. So it's kind of like OOP. It's kind of like a class almost. And then you can literally just call print on that struct, and it'll then call this function here. So we of course run this with one command, and then it fetches the object, the JSON, passes it and prints it out. So actually very, very efficient. Something else here worth noting is Golang, you can return multiple arguments. So in C, you can only return one. It's really painful if you're writing more complex code. Here, there isn't any limit. Also, it's worth noting that here we haven't defined any classes or any object orientation. So it's implied by having a function here which takes a pointer to a struct. So it makes it very efficient for writing code. So how do you interop with libraries that are already existing? That's actually really important. As an example, you have maybe a database library, you want to use it in Go. Actually very easy. You add a comment. This should be commented. Here in here main.go. You add a comment for the header file. And then import this C Go library. At that point, then you can just call c.hello in this case, and then it will call this this function here compiled in this code. Yeah. So actually, great. I have a typo here. Anyway, so the important thing here is you can integrate it with existing libraries very easily. So you can also use it in old projects, unlike newer projects, equally easily. This is something which like many languages, like Python, it's always been a little bit harder. Here is a list of all, like many of the features in the language. So just a quick tour of them. So if you want to install like a tool or like binary, you can actually just type go install and then the path to like GitHub, and then at the end latest, or a version string like which is tagged in Git, and then it'll fetch it. It will then compile it and any dependencies, and then it'll be installed into your like bin directory very easily. It supports fuzzing, so very important for security. So you can actually automatically fuzz your functions, and of course find any edge cases, corner cases which may crash your code. Of course, earlier we showed unit testing. It also every all your adapts are built in into the binary. So what you ship is everything self-contained, no additional files, no versioning, and then you can capture the shower of that, and then verify that is the full complete binary with all the depths. So easier to handle. Also, say if you want to compile on like ARM or something like that, you can just add the prefix go arch equals ARM64 or one of the other architectures, and you can easily cross-compile. Some other notable things here is any unused variables or like type mismatches will fail compilation. That's good because it will save you time later, and it'll reduce the technical debt. Actually, the rest I think you can research yourselves, and it's actually a very rich set of features here. So in summary, I think Python is very good. It's a very easy entry point, I think, into programming. But then I think those skills may not be useful in production at scale. So there could be other opportunities. Golang certainly is one of them. Many like large projects now use that, and also like many cloud services, like Grab, for example. All the infra is written in Go. There are some issues here also. So I'd say that yeah, Python's versioning can be a problem, so has like definitely limits, but then also they actually have a lot of support there. Of course, like Go is though only 12 years old, so has much fewer projects out there, but is moving fast. Other opportunities could be Rust, but then Rust is also like very recent as well, also changing and evolving over time. But the problem is it's actually quite complex. So maybe something which is harder teaching in university, and maybe it isn't as like productive perhaps. So I'd say it's an excellent. It's definitely worthwhile looking into Go. Thank you. Any questions?
So I want to introduce myself first. So I come from Java background. So you know that in Java we have like a lot of libraries, a lot of dependencies, right? And I want to ask your opinions about the biggest limitations in Go ecosystem that you like found out so far in your coding adventures?
Yeah, so he asked if what are the biggest limitations in the Go community? Is it or like Go generally? What are the biggest limitations compared, say, with Java? I'd say that Go is only like 12 years old, so it isn't as mature, and so there are fewer projects out there than in Java or like Python. But then it's moving fast. So in like further like 5 or like 10 years, there'll be a lot of traction, a lot of like much bigger ecosystem. It's actually growing rapidly, so it's definitely worth evaluating. It's also maybe lighter weight, I think, than Java. And it might be also like somewhat faster, I think, in execution speed. Yeah. Is that answering your question?
So I mean that, do you encounter any problem in finding, like for example, a library in Go that is like not working or like not like match your expectation, kind of that? So do you have that kind of experience when developing in Go?
Yeah. So the question is, are there any issues that you found using Go actually in practice? Answer is yes. What I find is as I say, there may be projects which or like libraries which aren't out there which do exactly what you need. So sometimes you have to like modify existing ones, or you have to like kind of write your own. Unlike, say, in Python, probably there are libraries for everything. So on the other hand, though, it's very, very easy to then compose projects with other projects, other libraries. So you can like reuse code like super efficiently in Go. And so I think that's changing, and there is definitely a lot more support than there used to be. Any more questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for joining the session. The next presentation will be at 4. So we have like 10 more minutes to go. Okay. Hello again, everyone. So our next presenter is Roland Turner. Roland will be talking about open source communities as reminder man, better FOSS coexistence with hyperscalers. Thank you.
Okay. Right, that'll do. All right, good afternoon. This is a talk that I decided to do last year after this happened. It's like yet another VC-funded company has hired all of the developers for an open source project and then suddenly switched to a non-open source license. This has happened a number of times. It happened again last month with Redif. It's like, okay, surely there's a point where we can stop making this mistake again and again and again. What inspired me to talk about it, however, was reading the license that HashiCorp used. They did something I didn't expect and hadn't seen before. Firstly, the basic grant of license was for non-production use. So this is a typical, you can still have access to the source, but you're not allowed to use it in any commercially useful or economically useful way. Source available, not open source. Secondly, they thought it was interesting. They were fairly specific about that you can use it in production as long as you're not competing with HashiCorp's paid version of the licensed work. It's a reasonably narrow exclusion. It's narrower, for example, than MongoDB used several years ago. And I thought, okay, not terrible, not great, not open source, but they're doing the right thing. They later revised it and they went one step further and did something I've never seen before. And that was said that whether or not the thing is competitive is determined at the point where you took the license, not how HashiCorp's business changed later. For corporations who are embedding this into some sort of product, a database engine typically, this is one of the major risk areas for the don't compete with us licenses of the kind that Elastic and Mongo have used. That what you're agreeing is to not do something that's competitive with the grantor, but you don't know how the grantor's business will evolve over the next several years. So what HashiCorp did in the revised version of their license was also said, if our business changes after you take the code, and we're therefore in direct competition, that's fine. Your license is still valid. You don't get licenses for newer versions, but you don't suddenly lose the right to use the code that you've embedded just because we changed our business. So this is pretty impressive. It's not open source, but if you're looking for a way to sort of do the minimum damage possible, they're fairly good choices. But then I noticed something else that wasn't mentioned in their press release. This is actually comes from MariaDB, but they used it as is. And it's that there's a fallback option built into the license. This is not optional. This is not a promise about something they'll do in the future. It's a perfected grant today that says that you get full rights under some other license, in this case, MPL2, what Firefox uses, 4 dates from the date of the release. It's not if we make a release or if we get around to it. It's a complete grant already. As a risk management measure for a company that might be looking to embed this into some other product, this is also important. This means that if HashiCorp as an organization fails, which anything up to 90% of VC-funded companies do, then it's not orphaned. You end up with the work disappearing into a black hole where no one sees it again. It automatically falls back into open source several years into the future. That might be a long period of time, but 4 years into the future is better than never. I noticed, however, when I saw this, hang on, I've seen this before. This idea comes up in a completely separate area of law that's unrelated to copyright, and that's estate law. It's used typically if someone comes in a lot of money and wants to look after their family members without risking spoiling them. So instead of handing the nieces and nephews a pile of cash, instead buy them a house and provide them with a life interest. They can't sell the house, they can't spend it, they can't hypothecate it to lenders, because after they die, it then goes to some other named party. This has been used in estate law for centuries as part of stabilizing family fortunes. So it's quite a well-tested area of law. I was thinking about explaining how this works, but when I got into detail, it's complicated, tedious, and doesn't actually teach us very much, other than to say that it is a well-understood approach. And so it's turning up in open source adjacent licensing is interesting. The other thing that I discovered after proposing the talk was that the Creative Commons group had already looked at this several years ago. Their brief is a bit different. They're not interested in software. They're more interested in authors of books or lyrics for songs or performances of songs. They were typically looking at much longer terms, 14 years for one project they built. And they were especially interested in what happens when the author dies. So it's not quite the same problem as the business software license solves. And in particular, they were looking at 3 different use cases. One about a license that springs into effect upon the death. One that springs into effect after a work has recouped its credit. This is like the street performer protocol, but saying we'll publish the work. I have a flat battery. And then we'll publish it on an open license once we've made enough money. And then finally, the idea that I'm talking about, which is a fixed period of time. The problem that Creative Commons picked up for 2 of the 3 cases that they were studying is that these require an organization. They require someone to keep track of whether or not the person's alive. That's not as easy as it sounds for a global project. And certainly evaluating whether the costs have been recouped and therefore triggering the transition to open requires a 1, 2, 2. Okay. So, yes, the important issue is that the Creative Commons study, they were interested in all 3 use cases. And so the fact that this 3rd use case happens not to need an organization to hang around as trustee or escrow or some similar role was an interesting observation, but not critical to their study. Their study said, we need these, and that turned out to be a problem. They did build such a program, but it had very little uptake. And so what I'd point out is that for free and open source communities, you don't need this. The fact that the grants are automatic has been a really important part of how these licensing schemes have worked. And so I'd suggest that with respect to remainder type arrangements, we should be sticking here, not building in dependence upon a trustee or an escrow agent. The idea is not completely new. GoScript, almost from the outset, has been on a basis of we'll do our commercial licenses and then a year later for the same code, GPL. That was largely to keep a promise to Stallman, apparently. It's also in other fields. So open access academic journal articles usually have an embargo period, or some, that's usual. Some journals allow you to publish on an open access basis so long as you give them a 12-month embargo first. So in different shapes, this comes up in different places. And for much the same reason, that people who are to invest design or engineering work are looking for ways to earn a return on that work. And so one of the ways is at least a period of exclusivity rather than perpetual exclusivity. It is a compromise. This absolutely isn't, hey, we should build all open source projects this way. We should not. This is about improving the ability for open source projects to survive a particular kind of damage, and that's the risk of a VC acquiring them and then collapsing, not what we would want to see in a healthy project. The effects on free software and open source are slightly different, or they're aligned. Certainly, the commercial releases don't respect user freedom. So even if you've got this sort of delayed license option, you're nonetheless out there selling a commercial version that is non-freedom respecting. So it's clearly a very uncomfortable model for free software communities, and it discourages the formation of a healthy free software community around the project, because you know what's called a serial abandonware model. You're just receiving the next version and the next version. It's difficult to maintain a healthy project, but it provides a fail-safe. And this is the one that keeps burning us, is that projects get eaten and then the organization collapses. So it has some value. Open source, similar. What it does do fundamentally is prevent collaboration with competitors, which is unfortunate because that's exactly what the open source initiative was set up to do. That if you've got a bunch of people in large corporations who are working on infrastructure that doesn't affect customer buying decisions, there's no problem cooperating with programmers working in other organizations, even competitors, on your database layers or your other infrastructure. This gets in the way of that. Discourages a healthy community forming, as for the free software, provides the same fail-safe, and for business use, for businesses who are embedding components, it's a material risk mitigation. I've seen situations where we've had to pull out of a bid because we were reliant on a bit of software. We were stuck in an arrangement like this without the release to open source. So it's a risk reduction measure for businesses that want to incorporate open source components into a larger project. One of the issues here, and where I think the VCs in particular keep tripping over themselves, is not understanding where their crown jewels are. You've got to know what it is that you are selling to your customers. If you're a bank, what your customers care about is when they stick their card in the machine, cash comes out. They don't care what database you use. They don't care what languages you use, what operating system, what hosting provider. They care about, does the cash come out of the machine? However, so this first split is your engineering choices which affect customer purchase decisions. You never want to put that code in the hands of your competitors. It is positively harmful to put code that has that characteristic into open source. On the other hand, all of your other engineering choices don't affect customer purchase decisions, but they do affect the health of the organization. These are what Amazon calls undifferentiated heavy lifting. They're the stuff where you've got to spend engineering resource to make a useful product, but how you do it does not affect your customers' choices. And so what the argument I'd make here is that in general, you should never consider putting this stuff in open source. And if you set out to do it because you've heard that open source is fantastic and you want to paint everything open source, you're setting yourself up for disaster. Keep it separate. But if you absolutely can't, well, I'll get to that. But right. So, any South Park fans in the room? None at all. I won't explain this. Okay. Typical broken business plan. Do something that seems related to making money. Do, we're not sure what. And then in phase 3, profit. In South Park, the underpants gnomes were stealing underpants. That was phase 1, but you know, it's the same idea. Profit for VCs, 10 to 30% of the time, but fail anywhere up to 90%. So, what's popular? Make everything FOSS, because that gets the developers to come and work for us, and make a cloud service, because that's how everyone makes money nowadays. Okay, but hang on. Oh my God. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are now competing with us. Quick, throw all open source overboard. This is the pattern. This is the reaction that keeps happening, and it keeps happening because this is a broken business model. It was a joke in South Park. You're not supposed to build companies this way. So it will take time to get this to sink in with VCs, but what I'm getting at here is that it makes sense for VCs to know where the crown jewels are, know what it is that's customer differentiating, but also avoid competing with the FOSS communities that created your crown jewels. Don't get into that situation in the first place. Make sure the thing you're selling is not the thing that the open source community created in the first place. They need to be separate. In the case of MariaDB, which is where the business source license that HashiCorp used came from, it's max scale. They've produced a mechanism, a proxy essentially, to allow much, much larger scaling for MariaDB than was possible before. And that component is under the business source license, whereas MariaDB proper is under GNU GPL. So to keep separate what you give away and what you sell. But also, don't compete with the hyperscalers. No VC-funded company is in a position to compete with Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. It's nuts. You can't do it. You'll do a lot of damage before you crash, but you are going to fail anyway. So why start? By all means, hire a FOSS project team. But again, make your money selling the corporate specific bits. Don't try to sell the thing that was free before. And this is where the licensing thing comes up and why I think it's a good idea. If you absolutely must compete with hyperscalers because you're certain you have some compelling reason for doing so, at least think about the remainder interests of FOSS communities. The VCs know they're going to fail most of the time. So there's no downside in putting a 2-line entry in your license that says, and 4 years later, it's available under GNU GPL, because who cares? If they haven't made a profit by then, their work is meaningless. They don't lose anything by making the grant. I haven't yet worked out how to shop this around to VCs, but I've spent time with advising startups, maybe. For the hyperscalers, don't be evil. Hopefully everyone recognizes that as Google's slogan. Google, please be Google, but the same with the other guys. Please remember where your components came from and support the health of the communities that those components came from. Now, to be fair, they're learning how. After the whole debacle with Elastic, Amazon finally picked up hosting a project to run the open source version of Elastic. Microsoft is doing, or Azure is doing little pieces. They're certainly major contributors to Postgres. I don't know about GCP, but I assume Google is doing similar things. So it is happening, but we are having to learn what the OSI was founded to do 20 years ago, we're now having to learn to do with much, much bigger corporations. It's a work in progress. Developers, choose full FOSS wherever you can. Think about whether you need the latest features. In the situation that I got into with Mongo, it actually didn't matter that we were running a 3-year-old version. For our application, it was not publicly exposed, so the security thing wasn't a concern. We were not using any of the new features. We were perfectly happy to keep working with the old open source version. So that's certainly one option. If you can't, prefer projects with a full FOSS remainder interest, like what's in the HashiCorp, the 2-line thing that says in 4 years it's open. Granted, I can only give you 2 examples at the moment. That was all a bit quicker than planned. Questions? Nobody understood a thing I said, or I have covered the topic perfectly and there are no questions remaining. Please.
I have a question, but I can hear your sound because mic is a little bit noisy. But your topic is related to license, right? Some open source projects such as Redis recently changed their license, but some Korean developers or other countries developers says why they changed the license. If you have a opinion or other ideal choice, please tell me your opinion.
So to the first half, this is why. That they go out and do we're making everything FOSS in a cloud service, and then, wait, help, Amazon has turned up. We're stuffed. So that's why it happens. And it's going to keep happening because the business of Amazon, or AWS, Azure, and GCP is providing services specifically for developers. The undifferentiated heavy lifting that's interesting for open source projects is also Amazon's slogan. So there's an issue there, and it will keep happening. And so the solution that I'm proposing is that one. This is the business source license for MariaDB. In addition to limiting the use up front, it also says 4 years after the release, it's available under MPL. This is not perfect. We would like it available from day one. But okay, a VC's in there making money, fine. Please protect us from your likely failure by embedding in the license an automatic grant that comes into place in 4 years. Not, I promise I will open source it in 4 years, but this is already in the license. For HashiCorp's, I get the product, but these words are already in the license. They're already effective. They won't give you rights for 4 years, but they're already effective. It's not perfect, but it's better than loss.
So this might be slightly unfair, and if it is, don't worry, don't answer it. The Cyber Resilience Act is a new piece of law in Europe, which we're all just starting to work out. And one of the things it does is give a new definition to open source, free and open source software that's never been used before. You cut me off, back again. That definition says that the software has to be developed in the open to be free and open source. So I think this will have a problem with that, but I don't know.
I am looking forward to studying the CRA. I haven't done so yet. Looking forward to it because it's, to my mind, an overdue involvement by regulators in addressing the harms that an enormous amount of abusive behavior is causing. Yes, a lot of the open source community is up in arms about it, but I think it's a desirable effect, or desirable outcome that regulators are getting involved. Yes, there's going to be some mistakes. With respect to redefining open source, sure, but like the ITAR, the upstream rules from ITAR, I can't think what they're called, that limit the trade in arms, define public domain in a way that we would find rather peculiar. Public domain for trade in arms regulations includes all open source. Up against before the idea that regulators write definitions for things that are different to what we understand them to mean. To answer your specific question, I won't know until I've had a chance to have a look at it. Do we risk having, at least for EU organizations, this strategy invalidated? Maybe. I know there was a great deal of hemming and hawing about developed, so I can't give you a good answer today, but it's one of the characteristics of regulatory involvement is that it is different in different jurisdictions. And so there will be wrinkles. It won't be uniform, and that's just part of the game. I'm okay for time? I have to.
Yeah, so has been a ongoing trend ever since, I guess, Elasticsearch did the first thing, then recently Matrix did it with their, and all of them had similar concerns that not only are do they have to compete with the cloud services do not offer any funding or donation, they make tons of profit, but so Element, the parent of Matrix, they said that 95% of our contributors come from ourselves, and all the other services use it, host us, but they do not contribute back. So is there any middle ground or any, I don't think if you know it or not, but have they ever tried with coming up with a profit sharing solution, or is there any place where all of them win?
I think that's a terrible idea and completely incompatible with free or open source. The thing that you're driving at is a sort of quid pro quo kind of thinking. It says, hey, I did this awesome thing because I felt that by making it public, I would get back good stuff. That's not how either mechanism works. Free software is about protecting the freedoms of individuals. Open source software is an efficient means of collaboration, but it's strictly voluntary. It is absolutely intended and expected that there will be actors who will take the code, use it internally, make changes, and not share those changes. And that gives rise to the affair of licenses, which is GPL and AGPL, there's a sort of non-quid pro quo thing going there. Well, that's fine, but that's got nothing to do with open source software. So the broad answer is no, and I don't think there should be. I think that would be quite damaging.
So yeah, is it a double-edged sword if I license the let's say JNE GPL, where it says that if you reuse it, you have to make your offering completely open source as well? Because then like other intentions usually that, let's say you have Postgres, which I guess works as a foundation, but then Elasticsearch is started as an organization, then it turned into a company, and then they started selling their own software. So when contributing, are there like then places where contributors can agree that I would want to work on the FOSS, like I'm okay with it being FOSS, but I'm not okay with them selling the same thing?
That's a much more complicated problem to have an upfront solution for. I think it's worth bearing in mind, and this gets missed, that the terms, what's happening under the HashiCorp license and others is that there are two separate license grants, and that you're receiving either one or the other. Or there's three or more. In the GoScript case, there are three grants, and you are deciding as licensee which one you're taking it under. And so you're sort of binding yourself onto a particular course. If you then change your mind, then you bear the costs, not anybody else. If you do a different stream and different costs means you've got to pay fees or share code or change your agreements, that's the deal. That's the cost that you incurred by making that choice. But it's worth understanding when there's multiple grants, you are choosing one of them. It's your right to choose, but also your cost. I hope that answers your question. All right. Time? All right, I think maybe one more. Hello.
I have a question. As far as I know, open source license policies are not like well protected in Vietnam by the law. So do you have any like advice for maintainers or leaders of developer teams to prevent them from the code stealer?
I haven't studied the jurisprudence in Vietnam. My understanding is that Vietnam is a signatory to the Berne Convention. So there is certainly a course of action, that is to say, overseas licensors who are harmed have standing. So they should be able to use the Vietnamese courts to resolve disputes, but I don't know what the current state is. If the situation, excuse me, my phone is reminding me to finish. If the situation is that the courts aren't, or if the situation is the courts are disregarding the copyright law consequences of open source licensing, that probably means action with your legislators. If the situation is just that it's ambiguous because no one's ever taken a case all the way through to judgment, then the usual solution is to find a model plaintiff. Find someone who's been harmed, but is plausible on the stand. And so that when they're brought in front of a court, the court doesn't have reason to rule against them. This is used all over the world in multiple jurisdictions to bring trailblazing jurisprudence to bear. You start with a plaintiff who is sort of has clean hands, is plausible, isn't chonky. Because if you start with a plaintiff who isn't, then the court is like, well, why is it my problem to help you? But the question is whether it's that the law isn't clear or that the courts haven't dealt with it. That's two different strategies.
Thank you very much. So our next presentation will be Code Like Hairdryers, New Import Rules for Software in Europe. The presenter is Vittorio.
A lot of time for questions anyway. So this is actually a presentation about the Cyber Resilience Act that was mentioned before. Let's start from who I am. So can we move? No. I'm working for Open Exchange, which is a German open source software company. We make email and DNS software. You might know if you use Linux, Dovecot, which is the most widely used IMAP server, or Power DNS, which is a very common DNS resolver. So we are an open core company, thinking of the business models. 90% of what we do is fully free software, and we sell the 10% of extensions, which are closed to pay for everything. And personally, I've been involved in this kind of internal governance stuff for like 25 years now. So I'm an old guy. So before coming to the Cyber Resilience Act, and explaining you why you should care about a piece of European regulation while in Vietnam or in Asia in general, we have to understand that the approach that Europe has to internet regulation, which is an approach of, let's say, the third way between the US and China. So from the European perspective, Europe has sort of lost the race to the internet industry because most of the big tech companies are Americans. There's very few very big internet companies in Europe, maybe Spotify, Booking, which is Dutch but is owned by Americans. So the feeling is that sort of Europe lost the train and now has a big problem in terms of economy and also in terms of national security, independence. And so the only way that Europe has to address this problem is to make laws, regulation. This is a European specialty. And so the approach is to try to obtain what is called in Europe digital sovereignty, which is a mix of a number of a lot of things. But it basically means to be self-sufficient and not depend on other countries, even if friendly or not friendly, it doesn't care, but other countries for basic internet services like the ones we use every day, because all of our society and economy depends on internet services. And so promote, local alternatives, try to build European alternatives. And this includes open source. So there's a big push on open source by European authorities because it's seen as a way to promote the birth of alternatives to the big tech companies. But also there's a matter of economy. Basically, of course, all these services, cloud services that are bought from European companies, they are bought from American suppliers, or from Chinese, for example, hardware suppliers, or from other countries. It's money that goes somewhere else. It's a loss in tax revenue. And so this is also, there's a loss in tax revenue. And so this is a loss of money as well. And this is why Europe is really trying to build some kind of independence. And so this is why the approach of Europe is global. So the only thing that Europe can say is that we as Europe are a very big economy. So of course it's divided in 27 smaller economies and countries. But if you put the whole of the European Union together, it's almost similar to China in terms of the size. It's actually slightly bigger. So it's like the second economy in the world. And so the approach by the European authorities is anyone in the world will want to sell products in Europe. And so they will have to accept whatever laws we make, whatever rules we want, to be enabled to sell in Europe. Otherwise, we will start to fine them. And you might heard, if you listen, recently Europe has fined Apple for several billion euros or dollars for a number of privacy issues and competition issues. So we'll start to ask them money, fine them, and in the worst case, we will prevent them from entering the European market. And since everybody cares about the European market, of course, we are pretty sure that everybody will comply with the laws. And so this is a so-called Brussels effect. Because in fact, this is what happens. Usually Europe starts with some laws. You might have heard about the GDPR, which is the privacy regulation, because then it starts to become a model for the rest of the world. And the global internet platforms have to comply with the European regulation, and so they change their products. And often they end up changing their products also in other countries. And so the other countries also follow the same model as Europe, for example, in terms of privacy regulation. And so, given the success of the GDPR, which was the first one, now in the last few years, we've seen several new laws coming from Europe, just approved last year or so. The Digital Markets Act about competition, and others are about content regulation and a number of things, AI. So this is the background for the talk, which is about the Code Like Hairdryers, as you will see, or the Cyber Resilience Act. So if you ever worked for a company that sends products to Europe or builds products for European customers or European wholesalers, you know the CE mark. So any kind of hardware piece, even appliances from hairdryers, of course, then but also mobile phones, to be sold in Europe needs to have the CE mark. Even I have a Xiaomi phone. My Xiaomi phone has a label with the CE mark. Otherwise, I would not have been able to buy it in Europe. And so traditionally, even if you're a Chinese or an Asian supplier, you have to get this mark, which means that you have to follow a set of specifications for the safety, the electrical safety, the physical safety, and also the electronic behavior of the product. And in some cases, you have to get a certification from a third party. In other cases, you just have to follow the rules, and then you say, okay, I follow the rules, so I can get the CE mark. So, for example, if you take the hairdryer, this is a hairdryer made in China, and there's a CE mark that shows that it complies. So what happens now? The European authorities were worried, mostly by Log4j, we all know, but in general by the fact that software is now everywhere, and so bugs, vulnerabilities can really bring down the society, can stop the internet from working, and can stop companies, they can stop hospitals, and so they want more secure software. And so the great idea that people in Brussels said, why don't we ask software makers to put the CE mark on software as well? Which is, of course, not so clear. How can you put a CE mark on a piece of software, on a set of code lines? But this is what in the law. So they made this new piece of law, which applies to products with digital elements, which is basically any object that has hardware and or software. So it's an IoT device with some hardware and some software, but also just software. And so it includes also the cloud part. So as long as it is connected to the internet, it falls under this law, and it includes the cloud server part, so the code that runs on the server. And this, of course, was a problem for the open source community. So this came out, the first draft of this law came out about 18 months ago. And it was a shock for the open source community like us, but also like the foundations and everybody that cares about the open source movement in Europe. Because it's the first time that someone tries to regulate the way you make the code and to tell you how you make your code secure and to maybe give you punishment if you don't follow certain practices. And at the beginning, we were like, no, we don't want to be regulated. You cannot regulate code. I mean, open source is produced collaboratively by people all around the world. How can you check what they do? How can you put stamps? So do we have to certify, get the CE mark on every new version, every new release, every new line of code that they put in the repository? This can never work. And also, there were arguments about free speech. Traditionally, software is seen as a form of free speech in the US, in Europe. And so you should not be able to prevent someone from publishing software. And I mean, basically, there was this discussion in which the European authorities kept saying, yes, but people will just do whatever we want because they need to sell their software in Europe. And we would reply, but open source is not always a commercial product. People don't sell it in general. So, I mean, there are people would like, close down the repositories to Europe and make the software unavailable rather than, spend money and energies to comply with bureaucracy to certify the security of the code. But in the end, the feedback was that, it's really time for the software industry to become professional, and this includes the open source industry. So it's actually an objective of the European Commission to have less hobbyist projects and more companies around open source. And this was said very clearly. And companies have to take reliability, have to follow by the rules, and the whole of the software world has to become professional, whatever that means. So we worked for 1 year with the European authorities, trying to convince them to change draft. It's a complex process. I won't enter into the details. But in the end, after 1 year of negotiation, we got into this thing, which I will now explain. And basically, it's an algorithm that we made from the final text of the law to decide whether you are or are not affected by this regulation if you are making open source software. So basically, there's a couple of situations. The most common one is that you will be a manufacturer of software. So if you make the code, so if you are the entity that owns the code, like a company that runs the project or even a non-profit entity that runs the project, but you control the development, so you're like the main maintainer or like controlling the commits, and you make money out of it. And this is very broad. It's not just selling the software, it's also selling services around the software. It's also accepting donations around the software, especially if you maybe something of the domain remains to you. So you don't just pay costs, but you maybe get some sort of salary from the donations you receive. And then you are subject to this law, even if you are basically a non-profit, even if you are an individual. But as long as the software has some kind of commercial use, so it's used in products, as we said, products that have some digital elements. And if you are considered a manufacturer, so you meet these conditions, you will have to follow the best practices that are said in the law, which include, well, I will also get into this, but basically it's about following very basic, I'd say, cybersecurity practices that we should all follow anyway, so it's nothing really new. And provide the security patches throughout the life cycle of the software. So keep fixing the vulnerabilities when they are found and report the breaches to the European authorities, which was also a subject of contention because not everyone likes to report vulnerabilities to a government. But in the end, this is part of the obligation. And if you do all of these, you can get the CE mark. And so you can basically distribute your software in Europe. Then there's another case. If you are not a manufacturer, but you are an open source software steward, and this is a special role that was created basically for the big foundations, like Apache Foundation, Eclipse Foundation. And these are entities that don't write the code themselves, but they host the projects. So they say, we don't write the code. We cannot be responsible for the code, but still they host it. And so they got a smaller set of responsibilities, like checking what the projects do, and making sure that they follow the practices and cooperating with the authorities if there's a vulnerability and so on. And this applies basically to entities, juridical entities, not people, that host projects, that are not manufacturers, but host projects that may be used in products, in commercial products, and basically support the development of projects. And otherwise, if you don't meet these requirements, you're not affected by the law. So if you're just a random developer that is contributing code to other people's projects, then you're fine. You don't need to worry. It's basically the owner of the project that will have to comply with the law. Or if you don't make money anyway, so if the project is completely for free, there is no donation, no money collection, no services, nothing, then of course you're out of scope. Or if you're just supporting stuff as an individual, basically. Or if your project has no commercial interest, meaning that it's not used in any product that is sold anywhere in Europe. But the problem is that when you make a project and put it online, you never know who is going to use it. So if someone takes it and puts it into a commercial product in Europe, then you are responsible. And this is part of the problem, and this is part of why you should care. So let's say you are recognized as a code manufacturer, an open source code manufacturer, then this is what you have to do. I mean, this is very short. There will be pages and pages and pages written on what you have to do. But this is a short summary from what is in the law, which is basically never ship with any known vulnerability. By the way, the first draft of the law said never ship with any vulnerability, and it's clearly impossible to do. And even here, I mean, we managed to get the word known, and some clauses like, well, if it's really necessary, maybe you can ship with something minor if you need to push out a major fix or something like that. And so you have provide secure configurations, authenticate in a secure way, so no more default username admin, default password admin, and these kind of things. Encrypt your communications, track the upstream vulnerabilities of all the libraries you use, and disclose the vulnerabilities with care, but disclose them as soon as possible. And so do you need a certification? So one of the concerns was, as an open source project, especially the community one, I don't have a lot of money. So do I have to pay some company that checks my code and releases a certificate that the code is secure? And the answer, fortunately, is generally no. There is just one case in which you have to get a third party to assess your code and do an audit, which is if you make this kind of security-based product. So if you make smart cards, or hardware security stuff, encryption stuff, then you might have to get a third-party certificate to get the CE mark. Otherwise, you just have to write a document and maybe put it in a file together with a license and say that you followed all the best practices that are required by the law. And so in practice, which practices do you have to follow? Because it's easy to say, I have to check all the code for vulnerabilities, but in practice, what you have to do, especially if you have to prove that you did it, it's very important to be sure of exactly what you have to do. And this is going to be the work of the next 1 or 2 years. So there will be basically European standardization bodies, SENS and LEC or others, that will provide standards. I mean, like several, dozens of pages of guides of what you have to do, depending on which kind of software and what you do. So this is still to be done, and the community in Brussels is organizing to be part of the process and make sure that what comes out of this is actually reasonable. And if you rather have other parties imports, this is especially true of like IoT stuff or devices, then it's the importer that has to do this. So you might also find someone who is buying your product here and importing it in Europe, and then it's their responsibility to check the CE mark, validate the code, and be responsible for everything into the law. And also, the integrators may be responsible. So there was a question by the Debian community, like, okay, we have a small PC shop that takes a laptop and installs Debian and downloads packages. Who is responsible for making sure that the packages are okay, are not vulnerable? And in that case, the PC shop is responsible, according to the European authorities, because they are integrating other products, and so they have to check package by package that the package is certified, or at least is meeting the requirements of the law. And so this is also something that is not so nice. When of course, fortunately, this is not already in place. The text is now approved. So we have the law is finally approved. There's still a couple of validation phases, but in the end, it will enter into force by the end of this year. And then there's depending on which section of the law, there's like 2 or 3 years for compliance. So in the end, this is something that will have to be done in place by 2026, 27, not immediate. But still, you have to start thinking of this. And also, the US government now is starting to think at the same topic. And so they are also starting to think at something maybe lighter than this, with less obligations, because the US has a usually much lighter regulation. But it might be that also to bring your software into the US, you will have to comply with these kind of things. And so what I wanted to do here is just to give you a heads up and a very brief introduction and explain that this is coming. And if you're interested in working on global projects or distributing your products globally, then you have to take care about this. Thank you. And I think we have time for a couple of questions.
I was wondering about Debian in particular, actually. I did speak to one point about GDPR, and it was a difficult discussion. Does Debian intend to comply, or are they planning to your knowledge, or are they planning to just sort of, it's someone else's problem?
Okay. I don't know if you're inside the Debian community or follow it. There was a discussion, and there was also like a call for a vote on a statement that was very, very negative. Like, we will stop distributing Debian in Europe if you approve this law. Now, there have been discussions. So we brought people from Debian in front of the people from the European Commission. They started to talk to each other. And it might be that in the end, in the implementation phase, so when the actual standards are defined for what you have to do, we will try to find ways that make it easier for these kind of projects to survive. So it's unknown. I think it will depend on the implementation, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, I think this is quite helpful. My question is how the EU and the US, how the US and China respond to these the series of act and the time frame.
Well, the US was more vocal in general. Not specifically about this law, but about all the other laws like the digital markets. All this new wave of laws. They tried to stop them. They said, you're trying to, let's say, maybe not officially, don't quote me, not an official position of the US government, but the reaction in general by the American industry was like, you were not good enough to build your own big tech companies, and now you want to block us because you don't know how to compete fairly. So it was seen as a matter of competition, which is only in part, I think. Then, of course, there were discussions, and I think more or less now they're okay. So the US is fine with this kind of new regulations, and we'll see. About China, I don't really know. I mean, there was no official reaction that I know of by the Chinese government, so no idea if there were private talks. Could be. I think that in general, I mean, the Chinese makers are used at the CE mark for the physical stuff. So it might be that they will just consider this as one more thing they need to do to get to export to Europe, and it's fine.
Any other question? Okay. So thanks a lot. Thank you all.
To be here with you all. Can you all hear me okay? Because I know when I was listening, it was quite difficult. I'm just going to shut this. How many of you are software developers or engineers? Okay. Business people? A few business people, some of you are both. Lawyers? Ah, okay, okay. So I haven't been a lawyer for a few years. I'm going to start by saying that. So let's see how we get on. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about open source and what lies ahead. And in doing that, I'm going to pick up on some of the topics that the last two speakers covered. And I'm going to do a lot of stuff in a short space of time at a high level. So if we've got time at the end, I'm happy to talk to you more about any of the specific topics or follow up with me afterwards. So I got into open source 16 years ago. I was a lawyer and I joined a company some of you will know, Canonical. I've seen a few Ubuntu t-shirts around the conference, and I know that the Ubuntu operating system is very popular here. And I worked on that through Canonical for about 5 years. I left Canonical and I worked in a law firm for a couple of years. And then in, what year is this? 2019-20, I joined Open UK as the CEO and effectively a founder, because we've completely reinvented what Open UK is. So I do a number of different things as well as my job. Like most people in open source, I've got a number of hats, and I have been on different advisory boards. One of my favorite was with the UN. I have a couple of government appointments where I sit on UK boards. One of them is the Open Standards Advisory Board. And we've sort of seen over the last few years the rise of open source, which I'm going to talk about. So you'll see my name as CEO of Open UK on lists like this, which is very much about the status of open source more than it really is about me and how things are changing in the UK. And some of you will know this book. It was published in 2022. It's the worst thing I've ever done. It was, or it is 640 pages long, and I've had to read it 4 times every word from start to finish to get the edit right. And last week I was in Shenzhen. I was Nadia's guest in Shenzhen and attending a really interesting OSPO conference there. And I met 20 people, and there are over 30 who are translating that book into Mandarin. It's a huge task that they're undertaking, and we're hoping that it will be ready in October. It was super interesting to meet all these different people and to hear all their complaints about how hard it was to translate it. It made me feel better about how hard it was to edit it. And there's 26 different authors. Some of them joined me to launch it at All Things Open a couple of years ago, quite a few women, as you'll see. And that QR code, if you want a copy, will take you through to my website where you'll find it for free. And it's available open access. Feel free to share that with anybody. But you've got 26 experts who really know what they're talking about around law. And of course, I spend a lot of my life traveling the world, doing this kind of thing, talking to people at conferences. Now, there's actually 2 of us in the room today from Open UK. My board chairman, Andrew Waffa, is also here. So thank you very much for coming all this way to just check up on my talk, Andrew. And you'll see that Open UK is a very unique organization. Now, there are other country organizations, but they're not quite the same. We started with UK leadership in open technology. And you'll see it's not open source software. And it's very specifically not open source software, because we want to cover all the opens. So software, hardware, data. And increasingly, we're talking about standards, about AI. The last speaker talked about the standards needed for the Cyber Resilience Act. So we're looking at those standards and we're looking at the different shades of openness. And that's something we see increasingly with AI. And we're a really big organization in that we have lots and lots of people involved, but almost everybody is a volunteer. So we have 3 members of staff and everybody else works on different projects within the organization. And we have lots of different sponsors who have contributed to our funding, some of them also giving us benefits in kind, which have allowed us to evolve as an organization and to start to organize our conferences. And we work on open technology. We do it collaboratively globally, but we do that on 3 pillars. So we do community, legal and policy, and learning. And by community, we bring together the community in the UK. We do it through things like awards, through honors, where we celebrate the achievements of the people in the open source communities, the open technology communities in the UK. We do it through law and policy. And what we do is give a voice to that community in the UK, and we influence law and policy. So we respond to laws as they're going through Parliament where we have opportunity. And we also try to set the policy agenda. And we do that by suggesting things. This is a venue we had at COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference. And we had one of the biggest events there in the Fringe with about 200 people right at the end of lockdown after COVID in this amazing venue talking about sustainability. And we delivered a blueprint there on data centers and making them open tech and making them more sustainable by opening them up. And we have since then produced another one on electric vehicles. And these aren't about creating code, they're about bringing awareness to it and showing how sustainability can be improved. We started reporting in 2021, and you can see our different reports online. They're all Creative Commons and open for you to use. And we started last summer talking about AI. And I will talk to you a bit about AI because it's really important to the future of open source. I'll talk to you about different aspects of it. But it's a topic that I've avoided. And I've avoided AI in the same ways I've tried to avoid security, because you really have to understand what you're talking about in these spaces. And there are lots of people with opinions on them who are not deep experts, and that's all a bit worrying because you really, really have to get it. Some of you were in the room earlier when Divya was talking, and she obviously knows about security in depth as a technical expert. It's not something I know about in that way, so I won't generally talk about it. But with AI, last year we got to a stage where we had no choice. And as an open source, open technology community, we had to start to respond. So you can see our first 2 reports on that QR code. And this year's an important year in Europe. It's an important year in the US and in the UK because we have an election in each country and our governments will change, and that will impact open source hugely. So this is our open manifesto that we are proposing to our government, to the political parties, and our asks that we have. So that's important from a policy perspective. And these are the 3 key asks that we have. And then our third thing is about learning and development, about skills. So we bring the community together, we use their voice to influence law and policy, and then we try and build skills. And if you look at our little circle with the orange, the green, and the blue, it's meant to represent the community, the influence on law and policy, and then the skills development, and one arrow leads into the other forever. And we did a kids camp that's quite well known. If you're interested in it, it uses a microbit. And there's 2 camps, 10 lessons each. The second one, I'm proud of both, but the second one I'm really proud of. We were the runner-up in the GNOME Community Challenge with it, and it teaches the open source definition, which we'll come to in just a minute. We also have these training sessions, again, freely available if anybody's interested in learning more about business. And they have a number of different founders who talk about all the different things you need to know about running a business in the open, the things that make it different. So please take the assets and use them. And in everything we do, we try to create a sense of belonging and make space for everybody who wants to be in there. I know 1 or 2 of you in the room were speakers this year at State of OpenCon, and we're in our 3rd year in 2025. 4th and 5th of February in London, and I hope we'll see many of you there, and we'll have more and more international delegates. Almost 40% of our attendees this year came from all around the world. And it's a really good opportunity to get together after FOSSDEM. So the real stuff I'm meant to be talking to you about, the future of open source. So what is open source? I've noticed quite a few talks today about OpenAI, where they've talked about open source and they haven't actually said what they mean about it. And I think increasingly what open source means is becoming important to us. And that's not because I'm a boring ex-lawyer, although I am a boring ex-lawyer. It's because we have to understand what open source is to have an opinion on it, to be able to say something should be covered in a law, or that we're doing an open source business or we're not. And this is the open source definition, which I think was 25 years old last year. And you'll see there are 10 different definitions. Now, I often joke that we should recite them together because we all work in open source. But the reality is nobody in this room, maybe Anne could actually, because Anne was quoting some of it to me earlier, but mostly nobody in this room could tell you what the 10 definitions are. And for me, I have two favorite definitions, 5 and 6. And they're my favorites because I think they are at the heart of what open source is. And that's that anybody can use it for any purpose. Obviously, you have to comply with the license and do whatever the license requires. That could be attributing the author. It could be making source code available, depending on what license it is. But at the heart, they all have this same requirement that anybody can use the code. You don't have to worry about who you are or where in the world you are, and you can use it for any purpose. So you don't have to think each time you use it, can I use it? You just know that you can. And that allows a free flow and a movement of open source software that we don't see in any other kind of licensing. Now, back in 2008, when I joined Canonical, we were trying to get people to use open source, and it was really, really hard. We were knocking on doors, trying to get it adopted in companies, and they were saying no. And the people who were saying no were the risk professionals, the lawyers like you and me, the accountants, and the procurement people. And they were stopping open source going into companies. But that's changed. The Synopsis report last year said that 96% of code bases have open source dependencies, and 76% of code in those code bases was open source. So how do you go in 16 years from it being so difficult to it being the norm? Open source is what we all use in our infrastructure today. How does that happen? Well, we see digitalization, and we see that over a 10-year period, but we particularly see it through lockdown and COVID. So any organizations that hadn't digitalized already suddenly did. And what we see is when you have a digital environment, that it's defined by software. And what that means is that engineers and developers, many of you in this room, suddenly have more power in companies. You have a higher status in companies than you used to. And we also see something, Git, become really well used. And it changes how we get our code. Now, back at Canonical, we had Launchpad, but the one that you will all know is GitHub. You probably know GitLab as well, and the way that code is distributed. So these engineers, with their newfound power, are able to go and take code, bring it into their organizations and use it. And they do that without having to go through the boring lawyers, accountants, and procurement people. So suddenly they bypass and they fill their companies with open source, and it changes where the risk sits in their company. Most companies don't realize that yet, but importantly, it allows for the adoption of open source. Now, some of you will know this gentleman, Steve Wally. He's a good friend of mine, and he was giving a keynote in 2018 in Edinburgh. And Steve talks about Microsoft. When I first got involved in open source, Microsoft was public enemy #1. Every joke that I knew about open source, the punchline was Microsoft. And today, Microsoft, according to GitHub,
Hello.
Oh, we're having a battery change. Microsoft today is the #1 company in the world in terms of contributions to open source. So how do you go from a company that was the punchline of every joke to being the biggest contributor in the world? Well, what Steve would tell you is that Microsoft has been on a journey. And that journey involves 3 major factors. The first one is that every engineer, every developer who has learned to code in the last decade, 2 decades, they use open source. They recycle, they reuse, they don't reinvent, they don't create things from scratch. So that's how they want to work. And if you want to hire them, and remember, the market is suddenly much more competitive because of that digitalization. People want engineers. So you have to allow them to do open source. The second thing he'll tell you is that some of the best innovation was open source and is open source. So their customers come to them and ask for specific technology that is only available as open source packages, open source products. And then the third thing, and I know we already heard from Roland about cloud and hyperscalers, is that Microsoft runs a cloud business. You probably noticed that. And if you want to run an organization like Microsoft Azure, you have to use open source. And it's no good if you're in business just to use it. You have to engage with it. You have to contribute into the community if you want to have influence, if you want to be part of the ecosystem, if you want your staff to learn skills. So Steve would tell you that Microsoft's journey was based on those 3 things. And those 3 things are, I think, the basis of every company's journey. And it's not just every company, it's also the public sector, it's also governments. And in the UK, we've had an open source first policy for 12 years. I think we were the first country in the world to have it, but we see that journey increase. So open source is one, but is it sustainable? And I think that's the big question for everybody. You could reframe that question. You could say open source is one, but what has it won? Has it won a war? Has it won a battle? Who knows? And what we see is an increase in businesses around open source as the adoption has got higher and higher. We see business usage increase because it builds our infrastructure today. And this report, all my slides, if you want to go and follow up, you'll find the articles and things there. But this report was actually done in 2008. And it's the first report that I'm aware of on business models and open source. And it has 8 business models, and they haven't actually changed. Some of the names are a bit different now, but the actual, what the models are hasn't really changed. And what it says in that report is that open source is not a business model. So whatever you use open source for, that's up to you. If you want to build a business around it, if you want to release your business software, that's up to you, but you will not make money. You will not run a business just because it's open source. You have to have a business model, which is a separate thing. And you have to think through, if I'm going to open source my code, what does that mean? And I used to, when I worked in a law firm, I used to say to people, what if? What if someone else takes your code and uses it? And they would usually understand that that's what open source is. What if somebody else takes it and makes money from it? And you could see that it's mostly they weren't too sure about that. And then I would say, what if somebody else takes it and makes an awful lot of money out of it? And mostly they then didn't decide to open source their code. So although I really believed in open source, I was putting a lot of people off by telling them what the reality of open source is, that it's not a business model, that you have to have a business model. And that was in 2008. I was working in a law firm in 2013 and 14. So if we fast forward a few years, we see, I think 2021, Elastic, and I know Roland talked to you about the changes in licensing. And we see Elastic's founder, Shay Bannon, with this headline, and Shane's a long-term open source contributor who really understands it. but maybe hadn't thought through the business model, maybe had other reasons for why Elastic decided to change. But Elastic moved away from open source, moved away from that open source definition, moved away from an OSI approved license, and moved to the SSPL, the server-side public license, which is not approved and wouldn't be approved by the OSI because it doesn't meet the definition. I think the thing that everybody was upset about here is it says doubling down on open. So if you read that, what it makes you think is that, oh, they're going really open source, when actually they're moving away, they're moving to a proprietary model. And then we see last year in August, HashiCorp, which is one of everybody's, or was one of everybody's favorite open source companies, moving away from open source as well to the BSL, another non-open source approved license. A few years ago, we saw Redis move to something called the Commons Clause. It's not a different license, it's a clause that you add to an open source license. But of course, as soon as you add anything else, the license isn't approved anymore. And what that means is that it's not an open source license. So they did that for a little while, and now just a couple of weeks ago, talk about the future of open source is the fact that we've got companies that are building a model around open source software that maybe don't have a business model or have a business model that makes a lot of money. And in some of these cases, they're making a lot of money, but maybe they're not making enough money for their investors or their funders. So whatever the reason, what we're seeing is these single vendor companies in particular moving away. So I think we're going to see a couple of things happen because of this. We're going to see business models shift. We're going to see people looking into whether it's viable for them to open source their code, to think more about the business models when they're setting up a company. But I think we're also going to see a shift in how users choose open source, because there is definitely a vulnerability. There is a risk if you're using software that has a single vendor that later on they might move away from it. We saw MongoDB's CEO use the term bait and switch. You know, when you go fishing and you have bait to catch a fish, well, what he was suggesting is that open source is a marketing tool and you use it as bait. And then later when you want to make money, you switch away once you've hooked your users. So I think whatever your thoughts on whether this is right or wrong, this is happening and we need to put this into our future of open source. Vittorio was talking about the Cyber Resilience Act. I think it's a huge problem. I think it is likely to cause a lot of destruction in Europe into the digital economy. I suspect a lot of companies, a lot of small companies, a lot of individuals as they create code will have two options. They'll either have to put their code in a foundation so it becomes a steward and captured by the steward, or they will block their code going into the EU because they won't be able to take the risk. And I think what that may mean is that big companies, system integrators, the Fujitsus of this world will take that code and integrate it and take on the liability as the first distributor, because the small companies won't be willing to do it. And I suspect it could hugely backfire on the EU, who want to be the next Silicon Valley. Because if you're making it harder and harder for people to create businesses and to scale businesses, then I don't think that's going to be the way to make your area the next Bay Area. And not only do we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which is tough, we've got the Product Liability Directive coming down the line. And in the UK, we're still at consultation stage, so we haven't quite got laws. Now, why am I telling you about these laws? Again, is it back to because I'm a boring ex-lawyer? No. Why do you think suddenly governments are interested? Why are all these people making laws about open source, or that in fact open source? Suddenly it is hugely successful. Suddenly it's the basis of every enterprise's infrastructure. Suddenly it's the basis of our national infrastructures and our national critical infrastructure. So of course it's something that's important. Of course, it's something that governments want to see regulation around. I think they're taking the wrong approach. I think we should be looking at the end user, because the end user chooses what they use. And if they don't know what they're using, they ought to know what they're using. And liability, to me, should not sit with the companies, it should sit with the end user. And if you think about it, companies are already regulated in certain sectors. So things like mobile, healthcare, finance, heavily regulated. And the regulation for those is different from the regulation in our general economy. We also have issues with maintainers who are overworked, who are creating code that is used to huge value by companies, but who may not be making very much money themselves out of the code. And only last week we saw a real problem with a backdoor being put into a piece of software intentionally, a malicious act in a piece of software. And we see geopolitical shift, wars, Brexit, all of this has an impact on the future of open source. But I think probably the single biggest thing that's happening just now is AI. And you've seen lots today. These are the two reports I mentioned. I was forced to start to talk about it last year and to think about it. I will tell you again and again that I'm not an AI expert, but I do know a bit about open. And what we're seeing is 2 or 3 different problems from AI for open source. I think the first one is not knowing about licensing for the future. The second one is maintainers likely to have to deal with more and more contributions coming from AI. So submissions where they have to work out if that's AI generated or not, and whether or not they want to deal with them, and that the possibility they're going to have an awful lot more. And then we have this thing that I've already mentioned to you, the myths about open source and what it means and understanding the definition, and people saying something's open source that isn't. So last year, almost a year ago, we saw GTP4 come out, an AI shift. We saw Elon saying that it really was meant to be open in the first place. And we saw Google reacting to Llama being shared last February. And Llama was shared by Facebook, and it was shared for research. It wasn't shared on an open source license. It wasn't approved. It wasn't meant to be used beyond research. And what we saw was it was leaked. And lots of governments want to know how it was leaked, and we don't have a conclusion about that as of yet. But what we do know is that when it was leaked, we suddenly saw a massive increase in innovation in AI. And that innovation increase came from the open communities. Last July, we saw Llama 2 being shared, and we saw it shared on a license called the Llama Community License, which is not open source. But Open UK decided to be one of its partners and to back that. Now, it's obviously quite a controversial decision, and it's one that my whole board took, because Llama's license, Llama 2's license, isn't an open source license. However, it's an open license, and we felt it was important because it was going in the right direction. And as you move through the last 12 months and you see more and more open source, we felt it was good to have something that was moving us forwards. Because when we saw Grok being released a couple of weeks ago, with an open source Apache 2.0 licensed model and weights, we don't think we would have got to that so quickly if we hadn't seen those stepping stones. And we would like to see more and more of it being truly open sourced. But you also, as many of the speakers have told you through this conference, have to deal with open data. So in the UK, we again haven't regulated yet, but we have had a summit that brought many international countries together in the UK to look at the risks. And we've seen the G7 bring the Hiroshima process and a code of conduct forward. And as your other speakers this afternoon have told you, we've seen the first AI law in the world in Europe. It has 4 categories that are covered by the Act. And that AI Act has one that applies to the highest risk, that applies to open source, but it has 3 exemptions for open source software. So of course we have to understand what open source software means, or how do we know that the exemptions will work or apply to our AI? But it is very complex, and we're back to these problems with regulators. And we're back to the problem of regulators needing to engage with open source and trying to work out what it means and trying to understand it. And we see the risks understood of closed source proprietary software, and we see the risks that are associated with open source software and open AI being something that governments are struggling to understand. And we really need more organizations like Open UK talking to their governments and helping to explain to their governments and the regulators what open source is and how it works. Back in February at State of OpenCon, Open UK's conference, we saw Bruce Perrins talking about the future of open source. And what Bruce suggested was that separate to open source, there's likely to be a new category of software, and there's likely to be a new structure for that. And I have to say that I tend to agree, maybe not with exactly how that will manifest itself, how that will play out with Bruce. And I agree with Bruce that we're going to see something different. I think open source will stay in all of our lives and it will be something that is strong. But as we see more and more challenges from regulators, more and more companies trying to work out how to use open source and to build businesses around it, I think we'll see this licensing term, this licensing category that Roland was talking to you about earlier, become something that gets a name and gets recognized. And I think it's important that as an open source movement, we get behind that and work with it, because if we don't, there's still going to be confusion about what's open source and what isn't. So to make the future of open source strong, we need to see this other category of open software made clear. So I did say to you, I was going to try and get through an awful lot in a short space of time, but all of these different things impact that future. If you have any questions or you want to talk about any of those topics more with me, I'm happy to. And thank you very much, all of you, for staying so late. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you. This was the last presentation for today. Now we have the event, the dinner. So for all the speakers, I think that the bus is waiting outside. Please hurry.